Chapter 11 Concerns of the Alfheim Dominion. While Erich was dealing with the aftermath of Erich's interview, and the heat that he would receive as a result of it, there were far more important events occurring across the galaxy. Though the propaganda machine of the Germanic Star-Empire tried to downplay the fact that a Nurku hive fleet was rapidly approaching their territory, the supreme leader was far from calm about this occurrence. And he was not alone in this regard. On the home world of the Alfheim Dominion, within the tallest spire of its largest city, sat the Empress of the Light Elves, who had a completely stoic expression on her otherwise beautiful face. Though this otherworldly beauty appeared as if nothing in this universe could possibly cause a moment of genuine emotion to appear on her icy face, her heart was beating quite rapidly. While her youngest daughter reported information about one of their more powerful vassal states being annihilated by the Nurku hive fleet, it would appear that the Rylonian Imperium has been completely annihilated, their fleets have been reduced to debris scattered about their stars, while their worlds have been scarred of all life from the relentless onslaught of the devouring swarm. What remains of their race have fled their borders, and are seeking asylum in the nearest civilizations. Mother, the loss of a Tier 3 subgalactic power is a tragedy which affects our entire standing on the galactic stage. If the other powers were to learn of this, they would begin pressing us on our borders. While the Fifth Fleet is currently being dispatched to deal with the bugs, I fear the damage has already been done. Despite the grim news, Empress Lunaria Asterion did not react in the slightest. Instead, she posed a question which baffled her youngest daughter, in a voice that was both soft and angelic while still retaining the dignity and authority of a galactic empress. Celestia, if my calculations are correct, then it will only be a few years before the Nurku hive fleet, which the Admiralty has designated by the name Terminus, arrives at the borders of the Germanic Star-Empire. Is that correct? Celestia, like her mother, was perhaps one of the most, if not the most beautiful woman in the galaxy. At least by humanoid standards. Like all light elves, her skin was so pale that it was nearly glowing, while her ears were long and pointy, like the rest of her race. The woman's eyes were as cold as the sun, which the earth revolved around, while her hair was as white as snow. Her body, while somewhat tall by the standards of baseline humans, was slender but soft in all the right places. Like the rest of her species, her breasts were rather small, but that did not prevent her from having a perfect hourglass figure. Despite having a face that appeared to have been crafted by a cosmic entity who was hellbent on creating the perfect woman, Celestia was currently scowling, and yet it did not taint her features. Why was she scowling? Because even at a moment as dire as this, her mother was still obsessed with the Germanic Star-Empire, which was a minuscule interstellar civilization on the fringes of their territory. Believing perhaps her mother had not understood the urgency of which she reported, Celestia began to raise her voice to her esteemed mother, who was one of the most powerful beings in the entire galaxy. Mother, did you not hear me? The Rylonians have virtually gone extinct. There is a rampaging hive fleet in our territory, and our vassals have begun to doubt our ability to protect them. If that were not bad enough, our rivals on the galactic stage will soon take advantage of this chaos to press our borders. What does a Tier I regional power like the Germanic Star-Empire have to do with any of this? For the first time in over 1,000 years, Celestia had witnessed a hint of emotion appear on her mother's stoic face. The celestial beauty's brows furrowed ever so slightly as her voice raised in agitation. Celestia Asterion. You dare to raise your voice to your mother and empress. If you were not my daughter, I would have your atoms scattered for speaking to me in such a way. Immediately, Celestia felt shivers go down her spine. She had never seen her mother so outraged, and the fact that it was because she questioned the woman's clear obsession with a minor race only further added salt to injury. Just when Celestia was about to speak up again, her mother switched the subject. The Centennial War Games will be upon us in only 5 years. The last time they occurred 100 years ago, the Germanic Star-Empire surprised us all. A civilization that did not even meet all the minimum requirements to be considered a minor power had so thoroughly trounced many of the more exceptional regional powers in our quadrant, and they have only become more powerful since then. 40W current novels on NO, we, 3LB, in, .com. It is a pity that they do not yet have the resources to deal with a Nurku hive fleet by themselves, because I dare say that I am tempted to send my favorite attack hound to deal with these pesky bugs. Although, if our Fifth Fleet fails to defeat the Hive Fleet Terminus, then ultimately the GSE will be forced to fight them anyway. I wonder how they will surprise me then. Celestia could see a look of excitement flicker in her mother's eyes as she spoke about the recent upstart that had clearly stolen her attention for these past few centuries. For a race that was biologically immortal like the Light Elves, a few hundred years were comparable to a few days. For the life of her, Celestia could not understand her mother's borderline infatuation with such a young race, who had only recently entered the interstellar age, and thus she was forced to ask. Mother, I just don't understand what your obsession with the Germanic people is. Sure, they have developed quite rapidly, but there are other civilizations in our quadrant that develop at an even greater speed. So why do you favor them so much? Is it because of their looks? I will admit that they are attractive, perhaps more so than most, but we have other races as our vassals who are superior in that regard as well. Please, mother, explain to me what compels you to look at them with such excited eyes. Euneria looked at her daughter with a look of pity, as if she were gazing upon a young child who knew nothing of the greater universe. She sighed heavily, while internally debating whether or not she should tell her daughter the whole truth, or just part of it. After several moments of internal discord, the Empress of the Light Elves finally spoke about some of the thoughts that were flooding her ancient mind. Celestia, you know how old I am. For as long as I have lived and watched over our family's empire, I have never encountered anything remotely similar to the Germanic people. If logic applied to their species, then they should have been extinct the moment they fired upon the Weltarians nearly 400 years ago. And yet, despite only recently settling their new homeworld and having technology far below that of a Tier I minor power, the Germanic Star-Empire defeated a Tier 3 minor power in the conflict they refer to as the First Contact War. They did not do this by virtue of their military strength, but because of their tenacity, their ruthlessness, their ingenuity in the art of war, and their bloodlust. I have never seen a species, so heavily outnumbered and outgunned, utterly destroy their enemies the way Germanic people did in that conflict. In the centuries since the Germanic Star-Empire eradicated the Weltarian hegemony and their entire species, they have carved a mighty empire of their own. One which has evolved at a rapid rate. Technologically speaking, the Germanic race is now at the level of a Tier 3 regional power. However, their tenacity, ruthlessness, cunning, and ability to do anything to survive makes them capable of contending with even subgalactic powers. You ask why I am so. What was the word you used? Obsessed with the Germanic Star-Empire, it is because they are the perfect warhound to unleash upon my enemies. They are a race, born and bred for the purpose of war. In their society, the individual has no value beyond his utility to the state either as an instrument of war or production. So what if I favor them above all my other vassals? How many of those who swear fealty to our dynasty are able to win 100 wars in less than 300 years? Especially when you demand that they fight against enemies that are more powerful than themselves. The Germanic Star-Empire has lost many battles, sure, but they have never lost a war. That is something which the civilizations that have sucked up to us for countless years cannot claim themselves. The fact that you look down on them simply because of the size of their empire is a simple proof that you are still nothing more than a child. But I should expect nothing less than a woman who is not even 1,000 years old. I made you my heir not because of your ability, but as a testament to the love I have for your father. Clearly any one of your sisters would make a better ruler than you. Yet, you still have time to learn and expand your feeble mind. So I won't hold it against you. Celestia had practically broken the skin of her lip, which she was biting into in an act of frustration after hearing her mother's scolding. Though she now had a better understanding of why the woman favored the GSE so much more than any of her other vassals. She still had the feeling that there was something more to it than just the fact that they were an exceptional race of warriors. However, since the Empress did not want to inform her of why this was the case, she would not pry further. Instead, the young beauty bowed her head with fidelity to her mother before departing from the room. Once she was gone, an elderly member of the Light Elven race stepped forward from the shadows, with a peculiar expression on his aging face. He stroked his goatee in contemplation before asking the Empress why she had not chosen to tell her daughter the most important reason for her excessive patronage. I wonder if the reason you waited so long to mobilize the Fifth Fleet was to give your precious hounds an opportunity to expand. After all, you could have dispatched our forces to intercept the Hive Fleet terminus the moment they entered our borders, and yet you let the Rylonians fall. It was only after the supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire asked for your assistance that you dispatched your fleet, but where was your concern for your vassals when the Emperor of the Rylonians begged you for military aid? Euneria scowled at the old sage, who had posed a rather troublesome question to her. Though his assessment of her intentions was indeed accurate, to speak them aloud was nearly an act of treason. After all, if she did confirm this to be true, then the Empress of the Light Elves would be admitting to sacrificing a vessel which had served for her dynasty nearly 1,000,000 years for a recent upstart. If news of this got out, the entire quadrant would be up in arms over such a scandal. But did the most powerful woman in this quadrant of the Milky Way galaxy care about something so petty? No, she did not, and thus she rather shockingly admitted to the whole thing. The Rylonians have lost their last 50 wars with the proxies of those hideous dark-skinned freaks. Meanwhile, as I previously mentioned, the Germanic race is undefeated against opponents who, by all logic, should have emerged victorious. So what if I sacrificed those losers for my precious little puppies? Though all life in the Rylonian Imperium has been consumed by those fucking bugs, it is a simple matter of terraforming before those worlds can be absorbed into the Germanic Star-Empire, and if your prophecy indeed becomes reality, then they will have earned such a bountiful reward. Still, it will take millennia for such an upstart civilization to incorporate the vast territory of a subgalactic power, but when they finally do, they will be the most valuable weapon I have at my disposal. The elderly elf simply shook his head with disapproval before voicing his thoughts aloud. In the entirety of the Alfheim Imperium, only those old foggies who called themselves sages could speak to the Empress with such informality. I am beginning to think that your daughter is correct. You have become obsessed with your newest pets. And when your puppies finally lose in battle against your enemies, what then? Will you regret your choice to sacrifice such an ancient and loyal vessel for the sake of an upstart civilization? Despite the seriousness of the question, Lunaria did not treat it with any urgency, and instead gazed out of her window into the luscious utopia that was her homeworld. Whatever she was thinking about in that moment, only she knew. Chapter 12: Beating the Unwinnable Scenario. While the Alfheim Dominion had begun to move its forces against the High Fleet terminus, which was currently causing untold destruction within their quadrant of space, Erich was suffering through his cadet life. Though the administration of the academy had defended his actions in disciplining the new cadets, who had violated a number of regulations, the people of the Empire had begun to harass the young man all over social media. Naturally, this was the fault of none other than the up-and-coming idol Erich Krieger, who had not only made a particularly vicious post regarding his actions on the video that was taken, but had also appeared in an interview in one of the most popular daytime talk shows, condemning Erich and people like him for merely existing. Because of this, there was a new intensity in the atmosphere within the Naval Academy, as many of the new cadets who had just begun their first semester began to complain about the unfair advantage that mutants had over them. While they were outstarting families, the mutants had already gotten a head start in their academic life. Not only did mutants tend to be much higher on the leaderboard than the new cadets, and even most of the returning ones, but they were also higher ranked in the student body. Because of this, Erich, and those mutants who had ruthlessly pursued their studies like him, were now cadet officers, giving them the ability to effectively control those who had not yet achieved such a rank. Yet this was the nature of the military, and if any of the new cadets dared to give him lip, he could order any number of punishments for them to endure. Currently, Erich was taking a break from his simulation while looking at a post on the grid, on his profile, that was essentially a young woman in her teens telling him to kill himself. She was not the only person who had sent him such a message in the last hour. In fact, if he really wanted to read through them all, he would have millions, if not billions, of direct messages telling him to commit suicide. Despite this, Erich did not really seem to care about the abuse he was suffering on the Interstellar network. Instead, he focused on what mattered, and that was his schoolwork and simulations. Thus, after sighing his head and turning off the grid, he got back to the simulation at hand. For the past 6 months of his academic life, he had been running the same exact scenario that he had been using since he first stepped foot into the simulator all those months ago. By now he was no longer on recruit difficulty. He had successfully completed the scenario in all of its difficulties, except for one. Realism mode. Until now, 400 years worth of cadets had utterly failed to achieve a victory in this difficulty. In order to achieve a maximum grade, one needed to pass the veteran difficulty, after which, nobody had ever dared to fight the Narku High Fleet again. Who would bother enduring such pain and trauma when the outcome was simply predetermined? It was not just starfighter pilots who partook in this scenario. In fact, every specialization which one could go into within the Navy had to go through the apocalyptic scenario, where they would fulfill their role to the best of their ability, and despite this, nobody in the last 400 years had ever been able to achieve a victory on the realism mode. After all, the simulation was designed as an unwinnable scenario. No matter how skilled one was at their job, the entire navy of the Germanic Star-Empire was not capable of contending with a Narku High Fleet, and because of this, there was no chance of victory. Any attempts to complete the scenario in realism mode would only lower one's grade and ranking on the leaderboard, thus the number of people who had attempted to complete it more than once was numbered in the hundreds at the most. Yet Erich was undeterred. Even after dropping into the bottom 1% of students on the leaderboard, he wanted more than anything to complete this scenario. By now, he had logged in thousands of hours over the last 6 months since he had first stepped foot into the academy, and more pain, sweat, and tears than he cared to admit shading, he realized that he simply could not beat the scenario in a standard dagger. Thus, nearly 2 months ago now, which was a month after the new semester had begun, he started training with a heavy bomber. Today, however, he had made his load out of the spaceship different from he had normally equipped it with. The bomber did not carry several smaller payloads, instead it carried a single massive torpedo. The strategy that Erich had come up with was suicidal, to say the least. After so many hours of training in the simulator to beat this scenario, the words of his old high school history teacher finally rang through his head. Self-sacrifice is the first principle of civilization. Thus, after nearly 100 attempts so far today, he had still completely failed to achieve his goal. However, as of this moment, when he was in the cockpit of the heavy bomber, he had a good feeling about his chances of success, and thus, he had a wide smile on his face as he carefully navigated through the Narku drones which all attempted to tear his bomber apart. Luckily for him, the simulated fighters of his wing continued to clear a path forward, allowing him to focus on his one and only goal. 10,000 kilometers became 6, and 6 became 3, until finally Erich had gotten so close to his target that he could not possibly miss his mark. Knowing that after he fired this torpedo he was as good as dead. There was a sense of anxiety which flooded his body. And yet, Erich still pressed the button of his joystick, which launched his massive torpedo. Time felt like it had slowed down as the torpedo flew straight into the open hangar of Narku hive ship, which, after thousands of hours of trial and error, Erich had determined to be the one which housed the hive queen. Suddenly, a massive explosion occurred. The blast was so exceptional that it consumed the entire hive ship, which was practically the size of a dwarf planet. The antimatter torpedo which Erich had launched was not supposed to be wielded by heavy bombers, but could be modified to do so in a time of need. Read Latson chapters at bin.com only. In fact, the parameters to equip the torpedo to the heavy bomber were not even in the simulation. Instead, Erich had used his cyberkinesis to modify the scenario so that he would be able to gain the authority to attach such a destructive weapon to his bomber, albeit after much effort on his part. This torpedo was nicknamed the World Killer by Germanic Star-Empire and was designed to blow up planets which were determined to be incapable of saving for whatever reason. That's right, the Empire would rather blow up its own worlds than allow them to fall into the hands of another race. These torpedoes were in every fleet, but were seldom used in combat, due to just how powerful they were. The moment the explosive blast devastated the hive ship, it rapidly expanded into space, consuming Erich's entire ship, and engulfing himself as well. But unlike every other time he had perished in the simulator, the simulation did not end with his death. Instead, the battle continued to rage on, as the drones which ravaged the Imperial fleet entered a state of frenzy, where they began to devour each other, as if they were no longer capable of determining who was friend and who was foe. In the end, a large banner appeared on the screen, which Erich was now watching as a spectator that said a single word. Victory! Immediately afterward, the holodeck shut down and became just another empty warehouse. The lieutenant who was in charge of the holodeck stared in disbelief at what he had just seen. Normally, it was his job to report any cheating that might occur in the simulator, but he had a hard time arguing that Erich had actually done anything wrong. And thus he watched the entire scene unfold with shock and bewilderment in his eyes. The moment Erich began to cheer in the empty warehouse, the lieutenant quickly contacted his superior on the grid and informed him of just what he had witnessed happen on this day. Not that he needed to, for the moment Erich had emerged victorious in the unwinnable scenario, the entire Admiralty had been alerted of the incident. As for Erich, the number on his uniform's breast pocket had suddenly dropped from nearly the bottom of the leaderboard, which was the result of his repeated failures that had suffered these past 6 months because of realism mode, to rank 97. After accomplishing the impossible, he had jumped straight into the top 100 cadets at the Naval Academy on Germania, meaning he was within the top 100 naval cadets in the entire empire. The moment after Erich had stopped celebrating and stepped out of the holodeck, he found himself surrounded by several instructors, including the admiral tasked with leading the academy. There was a stern look on the man's face as he spit a barrage of questions at the young man who was standing in front of him. How the hell did you win? You can't win. It's not designed to be beaten. You must have cheated somehow. Erich looked away awkwardly as he heard this accusation. While what he did could be considered cheating, and probably was in the eyes of most people. However, it wasn't explicitly mentioned against the rules. After all, as long as he did not interfere with the direct outcome of the scenario, he could use his cyberkinesis to some extent, and thus he admitted to what he had done, rather than try to conceal it. I simply used my ability to manipulate the parameters that would allow me to convince the admiral on board the carrier to equip my heavy bomber with a planet killer. Which according to the AI which runs the program, that was not considered cheating. It took me half a day, just to convince the stubborn old goat to allow me to do so, but once I did, I was able to load a planet killer on my bomber, and all that was left was the matter of getting within such a short distance of the enemy hive ship, that it was impossible to miss. I figured that the only way to win in such an impossible scenario is for each man to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the empire. Thus, after a particularly rousing speech, I had the comrades in my wing clear a way for me to get close enough to launch my torpedo into the hangar bay of the hive ship which contained the queen. Which I had discovered the identity of after a particularly brutal death roughly 2 weeks ago. Honestly, I did not even know if the hive queen would be on the same ship, so it was really a matter of luck as to whether or not I succeeded. The admiral stared in disbelief at Erich after he heard just how the young man had managed to accomplish something that no cadet had succeeded in doing over the past 400 years. Even after hearing this explanation, the admiral determined that it was a feat that required a hell of a lot of planning and a certain degree of luck to pull off. However, even though Erich tampered with the parameters of the simulation to allow him to convince the admiral to accept such a harebrained, desperate, and suicidal scheme, he had not actually interfered with anything that would not be realistic in such a desperate situation. In fact, he had not even forced the admiral to agree to his request, and had spent half a day of attempts just to get the man to agree. This required not only effective communication skills, but solid reasoning, and a hell of a lot of charisma. And thus, while many people would believe that Erich had, in fact, cheated, he had only really bent the rules in a way which was still considered acceptable by the Admiralty. Which was immediately confirmed by the recordings of his last 6 months' worth of attempts on this scenario. This left the admiral in a state of total shock, and thus he could only say a single word, which was also the question he wanted to know the answer to most of all. Why? It was now Erich's turn to be shocked. Why would he go through so much effort just to beat an unwinnable scenario? Because even if it was designed to result in nothing but failure, it was still a very real possibility which the Empire could one day face. And knowing this, Erich would be remiss if he did not find a way to emerge victorious, thus he was quick to voice this belief, which seemed so obvious to him, yet so alien to everyone else. Isn't it obvious? Because it is my duty to do so. Self-sacrifice is the first principle of civilization. No matter how unified the Germanic people may be as a race, and despite the fact that individualism had been effectively stamped out of their society through a lifetime of collectivist propaganda, the Germanic race was still an offshoot of humanity, and because of this, everyone was still selfish at the end of the day. And though it was possible to be cloned into another body with all of your memories intact upon death, mankind would instinctively avoid their deaths, even if it came at the expense of their entire civilization. Thus, for Erich to blatantly say it was his duty to sacrifice himself for the good of his people, after displaying such a willingness to do so, even if it was a simulation. This had caused all the naval officers standing in front of him who had witnessed these words to suddenly feel like a bunch of frauds. Chapter 13: A One-Sided Vendetta. Nobody could have predicted how far the simulation footage of Erich's unparalleled accomplishment would spread across the Empire. Perhaps it was the act of the lieutenant who ran the simulation, but almost immediately after achieving a victory in an unwinnable scenario, the footage was leaked to the grid. All across the Empire, people were commenting on the feat that nobody had managed to accomplish in the entire history of the Empire, at least not until this moment. The comments ranged from discussions about Erich's status as a mutant, to accusations of cheating the system, and even some praise for his heroic actions. For those who had also taken part in the realistic difficulty of the scenario, they were quite shocked at the sheer force of will that Erich had displayed with his actions. Most men would quit after one attempt at realism mode, yet Erich had continued to take part in the simulation for months on end, until he had achieved victory. Naturally, these men sucked their praise as loud and often as they could manage. It did not take long before Erich was identified as the son of a sector governor, one on the frontier of the Empire's borders. The name Erich Jaeger had spread across the grid like wildfire, but his former peers from high school, who referred to him by his old nickname of Silber, soon drowned it out. However, none of them spoke about how they had bullied Erich in the past, instead they all acted as if they were on good terms with the young man who had accomplished the unthinkable. And while Germanic society was fighting amongst itself to determine whether Erich was a cheater or a potential hero in the making, the Admiralty had gathered in a conference call to speak about the young cadet and his astonishing feat. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable, and yet, this one cadet found a way to beat it. We are potentially looking at a future war hero. Webnovel chapters are published on Novell, bin.com. The admiral who said this was none other than the one tasked with leading the Naval Academy on Germania. Naturally, as the headmaster of the facility, he was a bit biased towards his cadets, and thus he had spoken up on Erich's behalf. But his words were not convincing to the entirety of the conference, as another admiral quickly spoke up in opposition. He clearly cheated the system. By using his cyberkinesis to alter the parameters of the mission, he had made it so he could acquire a weapon that was not supposed to be available to the operator. Retrofitting a planet-killer torpedo onto a heavy bomber? It has never been done before. And while many of the admirals who had gathered to speak about this topic nodded their heads in solidarity with the naysayer, there were those who joined the headmaster in Erich's defense. If he had violated any rules, then the AI would have shut down the simulation and alerted the Admiralty. If even the artificial intelligence, whose entire purpose is to manage the holodeck, did not prevent this cadet's actions, then tell me how this is breaking the rules. Not to mention, we have redundancies in place to prevent cheating of any kind. Do I need to remind you that in addition to the AI there is always an officer present to manage the simulation? You should be aware that the lieutenant in charge of the scenario signed off his approval on the cadet's actions, so who are you to disagree? The admirals began to squabble in disagreement. Half of them were in favor of Erich's actions, while the other half were against them. Ultimately, it took the voice of the Grand Admiral to silence the room. His voice carried almost as much weight as the supreme leader himself, and thus the moment he began to speak, everyone else immediately ceased their fierce debate and listened to what he had to say. I don't see anything particularly wrong with what this cadet has done. Despite the fact that he used a special ability to alter the simulation's parameters, he did not use them in a way that directly changed the outcome of the scenario. The fact of the matter is, it is entirely possible to outfit a planet-killer torpedo onto several different types of heavy bombers which the Imperial Navy employs, including the one that the aforementioned cadet used in the simulation. Through trial and error, he was able to identify which ship hosted the Hive Queen, something even we are unfamiliar with, which he then proceeded to use his natural charisma to not only convince the simulated admiral to agree to his unconventional idea, but he also managed to persuade the other pilots in his wing to sacrifice themselves so that he had a chance at victory. Realistically speaking, everything he did is entirely possible to achieve in an actual combat scenario, no matter how improbable. The only thing he did which could be considered an act of cheating was modify the parameters of the simulation so it would reflect this reality, something we all failed to consider in advance. The fact that this cadet was even capable of pulling off such a damn near impossible feat in this simulation is a proof that it can be done in the real world. And, in many ways, reflects our own failures to conceive such a strategy. He should be commended for his ingenuity, rather than condemned as a cheater, and I won't hear another word about it. Let the people say whatever they want about his actions, but as far as the Navy is concerned, Cadet Lieutenant Erich Jaeger has done nothing wrong. As if they had never dared to voice anything but the opinion that the Grand Admiral had just spoken, those who were once Erich's detractors among the Admiralty immediately switched sides and agreed with their boss. He should be promoted to the rank of Cadet Captain for this feat. We should also teach the tactics he used to emerge victorious in this unwinnable scenario to future generations. Perhaps we should refer to it as the Jaeger maneuver? In addition to this, we should also modify the scenario to allow for the use of planet killers, if the operator can obtain the authority to do so through their own means. The conference was in unanimous agreement with this suggestion, that just so happened to come from the lips of a previously opposing admiral. As for the Grand Admiral, he went back to remaining silent, observing the entire situation as he thought about how the weaponization of world killers on heavy bombers could be used to deal with threats that were considerably more powerful than the Imperial Navy. In another corner of the Empire, there was one young woman who was not the slightest bit pleased with the recent discussions that were taking place all across the interstellar network. Erika was biting on her thumb as she read the comments on her own profile, which were mocking her for insulting Erich. She could not believe that part of the public had so swiftly turned against her, all because some little mutant had beaten a mere simulation. So what if he had done so? It was not like he had actually destroyed a Narku Hive fleet. All he had done was achieve a victory in what was essentially a glorified video game. And as a result, she was quick to fire back in the comments about how Erich had, in reality, achieved nothing significant. This only further added fuel to the fire of those who were currently flaming her. Her entire fanbase was made up of men, and only men could understand how impressive Erich's achievement was, especially those who had actually partaken in the simulation themselves. After all, women were not permitted to join the military, so how could a pampered idol understand the pain which Erich was forced to endure for every defeat he suffered in the scenario? The very fact that he had chosen to endure the pain of death for months on end, in pursuit of an impossible goal, filled the men of the Empire with respect for this young cadet who just so happened to be a mutant. This was something a woman who pranced about on stage for a living could never truly understand. As a result, the young idol had turned off the grid in order to escape the billions of comments which flooded her social media profiles, calling her a and foolish little girl. She had to admit, she had never hated anyone more in her life than she did Erich at this very moment. If not for him, those men who were supposed to be her fans would not belittle her in such outrageous ways. It was absolutely infuriating. A fucking mutant had the gall to upstage her. She simply could not tolerate it. Despite the intense animosity she felt towards Erich in this moment, or perhaps because of it, the teenage idol began to dig through his social media to see if she could find anything to use against him. At first, all she saw were pictures of him, in his cadet uniform, which was a dark grey uniform, with a jet black trim, standing alongside his mutant friends while they all messed around at the academy. However, after searching through 6 months' worth of photos, videos, and comments about Erich's life at the Naval Academy, Erika finally found some dirt she could use to besmirch his name. It was a photo taken by the man the night he had first arrived in Germania, where he was standing next to a particularly beautiful Oni woman. In this photo, Erich had one arm wrapped around Yumi's shoulder, as his hand rested on her modest bust. At the same time, he was not wearing a shirt, while chugging a beer that was dangerously close to reaching the 1 liter limit which was imposed upon the Germanic people by the party. The look in Yumi's dark eyes was suggestive, to say the least, as was the sultry expression on her pretty face. And while Erika could not prove that Erich had committed a capital offense in the form of miscegenation, she could make this picture go viral and leave it up to the Germanic people on how they wished to interpret the image. Thus, she saved the photo before reposting it to her own social media, where she attached every tag she could think of to make it go viral. She also left a particularly spiteful comment, implying that Erich had openly committed multiple felonies in the photo, and should be put to death because of them. Immediately the teenage idol got the response she wanted, as billions of people across the empire saw the photo the moment she reposted it, where they began to question whether the young man who they once believed had the potential to become a hero of the empire was in reality a criminal and a race traitor. With a wide grin on her face, Erika voiced her thoughts aloud. "This is what you get for turning my fans against me, you fucking freak." After realizing that she had voiced some rather spiteful words, Erika looked around the room she currently sat in to make sure that nobody had heard her, before sighing in relief when she realized that she was all alone. For the briefest of moments, Erich knew what it was like to receive the respect of his fellow man, something he had fought his entire life to achieve. However, this did not last long, for shortly thereafter, the entire universe was back to telling him that he should kill himself. Except now there were even quite a few people threatening to kill him for committing the horrific act of racial disgrace, something which the empire took very seriously. Though there was no way to prove that he had done this, the public had already condemned him simply for a single photo, that on the surface was little more than showing how friendly he was with a foreign diplomat. Thus, at the moment, Erich was sitting in a diner, with the friends he had made at the university, all of which were actually curious whether he had actually fucked the only beauty in the photo. Chief among them was Carl, who appeared quite excited about the prospect. "Come on man, please tell me you got it on with that alien babe. You will absolutely be my hero for life if you did." Erich, however, looked at the man as if he were perhaps retarded, and responded with a non-answer. "Even if I did shack up with Yumi, why exactly would I admit to it? That is quite literally an admission of guilt to a crime that carries the death penalty. Do you really think I would be stupid enough to brag about that openly if I had committed such a serious offense?" Carl immediately feigned offense over the fact that his friend did not trust him with such a dangerous secret, while Dolph broke out into a wide smile before asking Erich an obvious question. "Oh, so her name is Yumi? You two must have gotten to know each other pretty well if she permitted you to use her given name. After all, I heard the Oni usually refer to one another by their surnames, unless they are particularly close. You might as well admit it, bro, you lost your V-card to a beautiful older Oni woman, you lucky bastard. If I weren't your friend, I'd want to strangle you right now." Erich chose not to respond to this, and instead grabbed one of his chicken nuggets and dunked it into his fry sauce before eating the thing whole. The sudden silence which he had chosen to engage in only further cemented the idea in his friends' minds that he had indeed slept with Yumi. Not that any of them cared. If anything, they were actually quite jealous because as mutants, they were destined to die as virgins. Yet Erich had seemingly escaped this cruel fate. Despite the envy that his friends portrayed, Erich was more concerned with this bitch of an idol who seemed to have an issue with him for a reason he could not identify. If it was only a matter of discriminating against mutants, then she would not have gone this far to do so. Clearly, the fact that he was a mutant and doing well for himself was deeply personal to Erika. He just could not understand why this was the case no matter how much he thought about it. There were plenty of mutants who lived acceptable lives across the empire, so why was this little bitch so fixated on making his life miserable? Honestly, Erich could live for 1,000,000 years and never come close to understanding the mind of a woman. It was simply an enigma that had eluded men since the dawn of their species. But there was nothing he could do about the targeted harassment that he was receiving from one of the empire's most popular rising talents, and thus, he could only do what he had always done since the day he was born. Lament his lot in life and endure the abuse that came his way. The best thing he could do now was to keep moving forward, and make something of himself to spite everyone who had ever spit on him for the color of his hair and eyes. And that was how he chose to live his life. Chapter 14 Disowned. It took nearly the rest of the semester for life to go back to normal for Erich. And the only reason this had happened was because the government of the Germanic Star-Empire had come out and made a public statement saying that they had investigated the claims regarding Erich's alleged act of racial disgrace and found that he had in reality committed no wrongdoing. This was shocking to Erich because he had 100% slept with Yumi the night he first moved to Germania to attend the Naval Academy. And if the government truly investigated the matter, it would be easy for them to convict him. Clearly, there was someone in a position of power looking after Erich, and he knew for a fact that it was not his father. There were only a handful of people in the empire who could bury his crimes, and each of them was a terrifying presence that he did not want to associate with. Little did Erich know that his little stunt in the simulator had caught the attention of the Grand Admiral himself, who was willing to overlook a simple act of youthful indiscretion when it was committed by such a promising young talent. When the semester ended and Erich received his grades, he was pleasantly surprised that he had maintained his flawless marks in all subjects. Though, in order to accomplish this, he was forced to work harder than he had ever done so in his life. As a result of his efforts, Erich was now at the rank of a cadet captain and stood proudly at number 13 on the leaderboard. Erich was officially halfway through his years at the Naval Academy, and by the time fall began next year, he would graduate before entering the most elite school the Empire had at its disposal. That was assuming he managed to maintain his current position on the leaderboard, or even improved it. After saying a particularly light-hearted farewell to his friends, Erich boarded a starship, which would take him back to his homeworld of Alemannia, where he would spend the holidays with his family, who he had not seen for almost an entire year. However, this time he did not have a chance encounter with a foreign beauty. Instead, Erich sat next to a group of Germanic citizens who immediately recognized him for being the mutant who had caused such controversy over these last few months. Despite their taunts, Erich did not respond to his fellow passengers, and instead thought deeply about how this past year at the academy had gone for him. He had met several friends, who he could already tell would be amongst his social circle until the day he finally died. As unreliable as Dolph, Karl, and Frederick could be, they were still a good group of guys and were unlikely to suffer a permanent death during their military careers. Something which could not be said for Erich, whose supremely dangerous role in the Navy would put him at such a risk quite often. Especially if he was forced to fight beyond the range of the Empire's interstellar network. After a particularly grueling journey back to Alemannia, Erich accessed the first taxi available, which drove him back to his parents' home. Where immediately upon entering the building, he was glommed by his mother, who was beyond happy to see that her son was doing so well for himself. "Erich, you are finally home at last. I missed you so much. Did you miss Mommy as well?" Erich had never seen his mother behave this way before, and he got the feeling that she was deeply worried about the attention he had gathered on the grid, especially after Erika had reposted the photo he took with Yumi in what seemed like a lifetime ago. However, he was quick to assure the woman that he was fine. After all, he was used to being harassed by the public, and all they could really do was say mean words to him over the grid, which had no effect whatsoever on his mental state. In all honesty, Erich could not fathom what kind of sensitive sissy would get so offended by such nonsense. "I'm fine, Mother, and yes, before you start pouting, I missed you." "Why wouldn't I? You are practically the only person in this universe who actually cares about me." Krista had a warm smile on her face as she hugged her eldest son tightly in her arms. These were exactly the words she wanted to hear and was quick to voice her agreement with them. "And don't you forget it. Now come, I have prepared all your favorite meals while I waited for your arrival. I can only imagine what kind of cheap food they feed you all at the academy." His mother's words were a bit harsh. The reality was there was nothing wrong with the food served at the Naval Academy. It was mostly healthy and tasted great. Though nothing could beat his mother's home cooking, at least not so far as Erich was concerned, and thus he smiled as he followed the woman into the dining room, where he saw that his father was sitting at the head of the table, by himself with a rather stern expression on his face. Upon seeing that her husband clearly intended to speak with their son in private, Krista took the hint and fled to the kitchen after leaving some parting words. "Oh, I just remembered the spätzle is still in the oven. I'll leave you two alone while I go fetch it." Though Erich did not want to speak with his father, he realized he had no choice but to do so, and thus quickly sat down at the table with a particularly loathsome expression on his otherwise handsome face as he spoke to his father in a rather informal manner. "Go ahead, get on with it. I doubt Mother is willing to wait forever for you to begin your little scolding." Heinrich looked at his errant son as if he was looking at a criminal, and could only click his tongue for several minutes, as if to audibly display the disdain he felt for his son at this moment before finally speaking in a voice filled with hatred. "You have a lot of nerve, you know that? After everything I have done for you over the years, you repay me by fucking some alien slut on the day you were supposed to report to the academy. Do you have any idea of the trouble you have caused me? I can pretty much say goodbye to becoming an over-sector governor within the next century thanks to your actions. The only reason your atoms haven't already been scattered across the universe is because the woman you slept with was the aunt of the Oni Emperor. And she went out of her way to make sure you weren't punished for your actions. Which is more than I can say for most of the idiots she seduces. Normally, this would have been the end of things, but you just had to post a photo of the two of you together in a way that made it seem like the two of you were fucking. Do you have any idea the flack I got from my superiors because that image of you went viral? I can't believe they haven't executed you already. I do not know what kind of powerful friends you have made at the Naval Academy, but you better watch your back from now on, because the favor he showed you, by burying the evidence of your crime, is the kind of debt you do not want to have. You are, without a doubt, my greatest failure in life, and unfortunately, I have the ultimate displeasure of being your father. I want you to go back to the academy and never show your face around here again. I will no longer allow you into my home after what you have done. You are an utter disgrace to our race and are no son of mine. Krista was secretly listening into the conversation and was utterly flabbergasted by what she had heard. She knew that her son was rather fond of only women, something she had gone to great lengths to conceal from her husband. But she had never believed that her boy would be foolish enough to actually act on those wicked desires. Nor did she expect that her husband would go to such lengths to punish their son for his crimes against the empire. The poor woman was in tears, knowing that this was perhaps the last time she would ever see her eldest son. And thus, she rushed forward out of the kitchen and clutched a dumbstruck Erich into her breast. "Oh Erich, what have you done?" It took several moments for Erich to realize that he had just effectively been disowned by his parents, and no matter how much his mother loved him, she was honor-bound to obey her husband. Thus, she could only cry and hug her son while comforting him over the fact that he had just lost his family. No longer welcomed in his own home, Erich quickly picked up his bags and left the scene without even saying another word to his parents. He then climbed into the nearest taxi and took the next flight back to Germania, where he would spend the rest of his winter vacation alone in his dorm room. For the entire duration of his flight, Erich stared into space, completely dumbfounded by the fact that his parents had disowned him. As much as he knew that his father had always despised him for being a mutant, he thought that the bond they shared as a family was strong enough to overcome that. Apparently, he had misjudged his father, who cared more about his political career and his public image than he did for his own son. If he was being honest with himself, losing his father and siblings was not something that Erich truly cared about, at least not after thinking about it for some time in silence. No, what tore his heart apart was the fact that he had just lost his mother, who was perhaps the only person in the universe who actually cared about him. Thus, after arriving at his dorm on Germania, and staring into space while taking a shower for what seemed to be a lifetime, Erich climbed into his bed and activated the grid. Honestly, he did not know what had come over him in the hour of his grief, but in his bewildered state he sent a direct message to someone who he had never spoken to before in his life, someone who hated his guts almost as much as his father. Dash. Erika had just gotten out of the bath and was dressed in nothing but a towel, which barely concealed her voluptuous figure. She had a pretty smile on her face as she dried her hair and applied her makeup. Never in a million years would she anticipate what was about to happen to her. New chapters will be fully updated at in.elbin.com. A direct message appeared in Erika's social media while she was dressing up her hair in a ponytail, which she immediately noticed. Thinking that perhaps it was her manager, she quickly opened the chat to see that it was from someone she was all too familiar with but had never spoken to in the past. "I hope you are happy with yourself. I don't know what I have ever done to make you hate me with such zeal, but because of you, I have officially been disowned. You will never know what it is like to be in my position, nor do I think you are remotely capable of the most basic form of empathy. But allow me to explain to you my situation, in the vain hope that you might learn from your actions and become a better person in the future. Since the day I was born, there has only ever been one person who has showed me any kindness that was beyond superficial, and now, thanks to you, I will never speak with her again. I have no one, and within a year, I will enter military service, where I will be risking my life so that pampered little girls like you can continue to live your carefree lives. So by all means, enjoy your victory, for you have effectively ruined my life, and yet despite my many hours of soul-searching, I can't think of what I have ever done to deserve this. Goodbye Erika, I hope we never meet in this life. Because I can't imagine what I would do to you if I ever saw you in person." Despite the fact that she had emerged victorious in her one-sided vendetta, Erika did not feel the slightest bit happy about this outcome. She had never once thought about the possible outcomes of her actions. After all, she was a teenage girl who was simply venting the frustrations she had with her condition by attacking someone similar to herself. It was never supposed to be anything serious. But now, after realizing the damage she had caused, the teenage idol felt as if there was a black hole in her chest, one which was constantly sucking the life out of her. She was just about to respond to Erich's message in an attempt to redeem herself when a knock resounded on her door. "Erika! What are you doing in there? You have 5 minutes before it is showtime. Hurry up." Knowing that she had a concert to perform, the pink-haired beauty turned off her notifications and finished getting dressed, before fulfilling her responsibilities as an up-and-coming idol. However, the guilt she felt in that moment had not vanished, and all she could do was mask the pain with a pretty smile and flirtatious gaze. Chapter 15 Making the Best of a Bad Situation. Erich went to sleep immediately after sending Erika the message, not because he was particularly tired, but because he was so sick of living that he just wanted his mind to fade to black for a few hours, so that he did not have to think about how everything had suddenly imploded on him. As for Erika, she performed on stage to the best of her ability, but everyone in the audience, and on the live stream, could tell that something was off about her. Whether it was the sound in her voice that appeared to be on the verge of cracking, or the expression on her face which made her look as if she was just barely managing to keep things together, everyone knew that something was going on with the young pop idol. And while the grid began to theorize about what had caused the teenage celebrity such distress, she concluded her act, and went straight back to her changing room, where she gazed upon the message that Erich had sent her in total silence for some time. Erika could not count the number of times she typed out a whole page worth of her thoughts, only to erase it time and again, fearing it was not a proper expression of her regret or her actions. In the end, after nearly 3 hours of trying to apologize in a way which was sincere and meaningful, she gave up on the idea and decided to simply cease her harassment of the man. This was the best decision that she could make after everything she had done. Erich awoke the next day sometime in the latter half of the morning. Though his mind was clear, and his body was more than capable of moving, he stayed perfectly still, as if completely lifeless for well over an hour. The thoughts that plagued his mind were myriad and troublesome. Losing his mother was perhaps the greatest blow ever dealt to his heart and mind. She was the only person who had ever really cared for him, and while he made some friends at the academy, they were not remotely close enough to be considered family at this point in time. He was truly alone in this universe, living in a society that hated him because of something he had no control over. Erich did not even bother accessing the grid, knowing that all which awaited him was harassment and death threats, something he could do without at this very moment. Instead, he dedicated the rest of his morning to thinking about his life and what he wanted to accomplish. Until now, he had just been going through the motions. Doing what was expected of him, performing his duty to the empire like everyone else. But did he really feel any pride for the nation he was born into? It is not like the Germanic Star-Empire cared the slightest whether he lived or died. No, he was a pawn for those in power to wield as they saw fit. The same could be said for everyone else, but at least his peers were rewarded for their struggles by the state. Every man was given a wife and encouraged to have a family. The state provided them with housing, food, water, medicine and every other resource that was required to live. And while Erich would earn himself a house after military service, it would be empty, with only himself filling up the space. Was this the life he really wanted to live? All alone, just as he was right now, for the next 250 years? And that was assuming he had an average lifespan. If he was particularly useful to the empire, they had plenty of ways to extend his life, and by extension, his misery. This was what life had in store for him if he chose to remain in the empire. However, defection was also not a viable option. Travel in and outside of the Germanic Star-Empire was strictly monitored, and if it was believed that you posed a risk of defection, you would not be permitted to leave. Find EW chapters on nvlbi.com. Assuming he somehow did manage to escape from his home, what would he do then? How would he live? The galaxy was a vast and unforgiving place, especially if you were on your own, with nobody else to look after you. Civilizations survived the harshness of space because they were united together, usually by race, not by striking it out on your own. However, a man who had abandoned his species would be looked down upon by everyone, and there were few safe havens that existed in the greater galaxy for those who were exiled from their homelands. In fact, Erich had never even heard of one existing. Thus, defection was simply not a realistic option. His fate was tied to the Empire, because the only other place that might reasonably accept him was the Confederation of Human Worlds. However, would they even recognize him as a member of the same species? After all, the Germanic people considered themselves to be an entirely different species than baseline humans and would never accept one in their society. Would the same not be true for those people whose evolution had diverged on a separate path centuries ago? Even if he did manage to be accepted by such a foreign and hostile society, their beliefs were simply too disgusting for Erich to tolerate. While he may have been discriminated against by Germanic society, he was by no means a liberal person, and despite the fact that the society which he lived in treated him poorly, Erich supported many of the things that his people believed, even if he was not as fanatical as the other members of his species. After several hours lost in thought, Erich was beginning to believe that he would never find happiness in the world, and that his best option was to simply toe the party line, and endure the abuse and harassment which came his way, just like he had always done. That is, until a specific memory suddenly flooded his mind, seemingly out of nowhere. It was the first day he had met his friends, when they were discussing the leaderboard and the rewards one would get for climbing its ranks. At first, Erich had assumed what he heard had been just another tall tale. After all, there were many rumors, such as the one that Karl had told him, which proved to be false. Thus, he did not even bother to investigate the validity of the claim. However, at the moment, Erich latched onto the words his friend had spoken, as if it were his only lifeline. I heard from a rather reliable source about a blacksmith pilot who was a mutant like us, but because of his achievements on the battlefield, the party permitted him to have a wife and children. Remembering these words, Erich quickly surfed the grid for any mention of such an unlikely story, and quickly found that it was indeed true. A pilot of the elite fighter squadron known by the name Black Sun had achieved such shocking achievements in combat that the restrictions which applied to mutants were lifted from him. In fact, after decades of exemplary service, the man finally retired from the Navy at the age of 65 and immediately became a planetary governor. He had risen above the discrimination that mutants faced in Germanic society and had even become a powerful member of the political party. However, there was no recent news on this individual or what rank he currently held. Still, if this man could achieve such a thing, then why couldn't he? Currently, Erich was ranked 13th on the Academy's leaderboards, and that was without really developing the special abilities he had, or using them in any significant capacity which could affect his ranking. If he truly began giving it his all from here on out, he could reach first place by the time he graduated next year, guaranteeing him a spot in the Empire's most elite flight school and an advantage over his peers when he finally entered military service. Thus, in that moment, Erich decided to not only stay within the borders of the Empire, but rise through its ranks, until one day everyone would have to kneel before him. Once he was the supreme leader, he could abolish the restrictions that mutants suffered through, and ensure that nobody like him ever had to endure what he had in life. Erich spent every waking hour during his vacation studying like a madman. When classes reconvened 2 weeks later, he had become a man possessed. Only through exceptional service to the state could he earn the right to have a family, something all of his peers had access to. Without a family of his own, there was no purpose to living in this universe. This was something which he felt in every atom of his being, and if he had to risk his life so that he could become a war hero, he would do it. Surprisingly, the harassment he received seemed to have died down, as Erika was no longer targeting him with every chance she could get. Whether she had given up because she had a change of heart after his message, or because she had already ruined his life and because of this, there was nothing further to be gained. Erich did not know the answer. What he did know is that he did not care either way, and thus he focused all of his effort on obtaining first place on the leaderboard. Whether it was PT in the morning, or all of his classes, Erich pushed himself beyond his natural limits, ensuring that he proved himself superior to the rest of his peers. It was not just his teachers and comrades who took notice of this sudden shift in behavior. In another part of the Empire's capital, a man sat in his office. It was a rather large office, with an excellent view of the city below. The red, black, and white banners of the Empire hung from the ceiling, showing off a display of both utilitarian and authoritarian ideology. This man was none other than the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy. His name was Erich Emmerich, a man born from Swiss ancestry, and who had climbed through the ranks of the Imperial Navy to the highest position after decades of exemplary service. Why was he named Erich instead of something more contemporary? Because during the decade he was born, there was a societal trend to revive ancient Germanic names as a symbol of the unity that existed between the various Germanic peoples who inhabited the empire. Ultimately, this trend did not last long, and by the time the next generation was born, they went back to more modern naming conventions. After learning that Heinrich had disowned his son, Erich was quite furious. Erich was a talent that was rare in the empire, and the boy had already proven to be quite innovative in his thinking. If the Empire was going to survive the hardships of the galaxy, it needed to invest in young men like Erich, even if they happened to be so-called mutants. This was the reason that he had gone to such great lengths to bury the evidence of Erich's little dalliance with the aunt of the Oni Emperor. The fact that all the hard work Erich had gone through in his efforts to conceal this crime from the public was repaid with such foolishness on the part of Erich's father was enough to make the Grand Admiral frustrated beyond belief. At first, Erich thought that Erich would be broken by being disowned. And yet, the most peculiar thing happened. The young man had doubled his performance. Erich had become a madman in pursuit of his military training and academic studies, spending even his lunch hour either studying or engaging in simulations. If it weren't for the curfew that was imposed upon all cadets, then Erich might even spend his entire nights in the holodeck. This had only increased Erich's opinion of Erich. He had become a man who had lost everything, a man who was scorned by society. And yet, he had not given up on life, nor had he chosen to abandon the empire, which showed him nothing but hostility, but instead had decided to double down and work even harder to make something of himself. How many men in Erich's position could do the same? The fierce determination that Erich displayed after being disowned was something that even the most prejudiced man should respect, and because of this, the Grand Admiral decided to watch Erich's future career with a close eye. Unknowingly, Erich had gained a very powerful backer, one who would do his best to direct the promising young talent's career, so that he could best make use of his abilities for the good of the Empire. Chapter 16 The Starfighter Tournament. At the start of spring, during Erich's second year at the Naval Academy, something interesting happened. By now, Erich was ranked number 10th on the leaderboard, and most of the students were making bets as to whether or not he would graduate the top of his class. though, despite his best efforts, Erich was having a difficult time getting past 10th place, and just when he had begun to feel as if he had no hope of climbing to his desired position in what little time remained before he graduated, a sudden announcement was made by the headmaster via the academy's internal network. On 22nd May 2500, we will be hosting a virtual reality starfighter tournament between all the naval academies within the Empire. For those cadets who have been selected for service within the Starfighter Corps, you are encouraged to participate in this tournament. The champion will be awarded with 1 million points and 250,000 credits. The sudden announcement of a starfighter tournament was almost too good to be true. Just when Erich thought that he would not be able to graduate at the top of his class, the heavens had given him a golden opportunity to do so. With the first place prize of 1 million points, Erich would jump straight into the top 3 ranking of all naval cadets in the Empire. From there, it was a stone's throw away to the number 1 position. And while the points immediately drew Erich's eye, he had to admit the 250,000 credit prize was also an enormous help to a man without a family. Credits were the primary currency used by the Empire for all transactions. Until now, the only income Erich had was through his monthly stipend, which he used primarily to feed himself. However, 250,000 credits were quite the vast sum, and would allow him to live comfortably for several years. Thus, this was a grand opportunity, one which he did not plan to miss out on. With this in mind, Erich immediately signed up for the Starfighter tournament, which would be held in virtual reality in the coming months. As for how he would prepare for this event, there was no greater test than accessing the Interstellar virtual reality network, where he would compete against other players in dogfights. Though if Erich did this, he would not just be fighting against fellow cadets, but also veteran pilots and hobbyists, giving him a wide sample pool of talent to train himself against. And while Erich was passionate about this God-given opportunity, he had no idea that it was all organized by the Grand Admiral as a way to assist his favorite cadet in gaining the highly coveted position as the top graduate of his class. Before Erich knew it, 22nd May had arrived, and thus, he spent the day in his room, attached to the virtual reality network. As he entered the Academy's lobby system for the tournament, a wide variety of competitors not just from his own naval academy, but the 99 other facilities which existed across the Germanic Star-Empire immediately greeted him. The looks on everyone's faces were the same as the expression that he himself wore: excitement. Adrenaline and endorphins pumped through Erich's blood as he waited for the free-for-all dogfights which would determine the first bracket of competitors. Each pilot would be paired up with a certain number of his rivals, and whoever was the last man standing would advance into the next bracket of the tournament. Billions of cadets were competing in this event, but because an infinite number of bouts were capable of being completed at the same time, they were effectively able to host the tournament in the span of a single day. The rules were simple: a cadet was only permitted to use a dagger, which was the primary starfighter of the Empire. He could use any special abilities he might have inherited, either from his parents or the genetic serum, and could use any other means at his disposal to win the battle royal. There were virtually no limits on what could be done to achieve victory. Thus Erich had an enormous advantage over his rivals due to his ability to control machines with his thoughts, and his ability to see 7 seconds into the future. However, in a battle royal that consisted of thousands of hostile starfighters, anything could happen, especially since he was not the only one with a few tricks up his sleeve. Immediately after entering the virtual reality world, Erich found himself in the middle of a dagger's cockpit, within an asteroid belt. The environment of each match was procedurally generated, and, if one was truly unlucky, they would have to compete near a black hole, or even a star that was about to go supernova. Because anything could happen in the vast emptiness of space, the simulator took these many probable scenarios and added them into the matches. While Erich had begun to set his engines to maximum speed, he noticed a countdown on his heads-up display, more commonly known as HUD, which signaled how long it would be until the match started. As the countdown got closer to 0, Erich felt his heart palpitate. This was it. Now was the time to sink or swim. And he did not intend to drown by any means. Thus, he kept his head on a swivel as the counter reached 0, before initiating his afterburners, which sent him barreling through the asteroid field as he searched for his nearest target. Navigating through an asteroid field at sublight speeds, with the possibility of an enemy lurking around every corner, was by no means a relaxing environment. In fact, Erich was sweating profusely, which was transmitted into the virtual world. After nearly 5 minutes of avoiding space debris, Erich's radar picked up a signature for a split second before it disappeared. Realizing that something wasn't right, Erich activated his special ability, which he referred to as foresight. Not only did he see 7 seconds into the future, but he also saw the multiple potential realities that were likely to occur during this time. For most of his life, Erich had neglected this ability, but after being disowned by his parents, and determining that the only way he would be able to obtain happiness through life was through relentless effort, he had begun training his abilities like a madman, and now he could quite easily decipher which outcome was the most likely to occur. Thus, in a microsecond, he had determined that the nearest enemy was hiding on the other side of an asteroid which was nearly 500 kilometers away, and had turned off his engines to avoid detection. The moment Erich passed by the asteroid, he would be gunned down by the man who was lying in wait for him. Realizing that this was the most likely possible outcome of the multiple visions he had seen, Erich locked onto the asteroid which the enemy was hiding behind with his targeting array, and launched an antimatter missile at it. Without even realizing his trap had been seen through, the enemy pilot was blown to smithereens, along with the asteroid that his starfighter sat upon. Immediately Erich was awarded with 500 points, which went to his ranking on the leaderboard. Excited that he had the potential to earn far more than 1 million credits overall from this tournament, Erich began adeptly navigating through the asteroid field, with his mind, rather than the joystick, as if his starfighter was just an extension of his body. The movements he made were completely unnatural, and had thrown off many of his pursuers. In fact, after being chased for well over 10,000 kilometers by an enemy, Erich suddenly reversed his engines with his mind to counter the force in which he was traveling through space, which allowed his craft to come to an abrupt and sudden stop. In the second that he did this, the pilot who was pursuing him shot right past his target, allowing Erich to lock onto him with a missile and blow him up. It was not just the students of the academy who watched the virtual reality tournament unfold. In fact, it was broadcasted across the Interstellar network, allowing everyone to witness this newest generation of starfighter pilots to display their abilities. And while there were quite literally millions if not billions of instances to choose from, the one which Erich was competing in drew the attention of many people, particularly because of the bizarre way which he managed to pilot his craft. Everyone immediately began to flood the comments of the livestream with remarks about Erich being a cheater, until one person in particular defended him, someone which nobody in the Empire thought would ever come to the mutant's defense. Erika Krieger typed a comment on the livestream which surprised everyone, one which thoroughly disproved the cheating narrative. He is not cheating. I looked into this man's background after he knocked out that cadet nearly a year ago and went viral. Erich Jaeger has two special abilities, telepathy and cyberkinesis. In other words, he is effectively able to communicate with his competitors and manipulate his starfighter in ways it was not designed to perform with nothing but his mind. No doubt, while he is controlling his starfighter, he is also disrupting his opponent's focus with a tidal wave of mental harassment. It is no wonder why he is able to so effortlessly shoot down his peers. It was exactly as Erika had hypothesized. While Erich was manipulating his starfighter with his mind, he was also mentally harassing his opponents with an unprecedented degree of vulgarity. Something which would get on the nerves and disrupt the focus of most beings in the universe. While taunting an opponent with a particularly vile comment about the man's female relatives, Erich shot across his bow with his plasma cannon, which had dealt the final blow to his target's shields. He immediately followed up with an attack from his 3 laser repeaters, which shredded through the armor of the starfighter, and effortlessly blew it up. After all, the plasma cannon had a limited number of shots that could be fired with each cell, and thus he had to conserve the more powerful weapon for the rest of his opponents. However, Erich had no time to celebrate this victory, because the moment he shot down the other pilot, someone launched a missile at him. Just before the antimatter missile collided with Erich's starfighter, he deployed his countermeasures, which drew the missile away. A latest novel is on, in, will be, go. Realizing that he had narrowly escaped defeat, Erich in a bout of anger targeted the opponent with his mind, and told him something so unspeakable that it had thrown off his focus, where Erich then lit him up with his laser repeaters, thus blowing the starfighter out of the sky. With this, Erich had scored his 1000th kill, and had become the last man standing, thus advancing on to the next round of the tournament. The world watched with awe as Erich expertly defeated his opponents while suffering minimal damage. The grid was flooded with angry comments about how overpowered Erich's cyberkinesis was, but nobody except for the top brass of the Germanic government knew that he actually had a tertiary ability, one that had saved his hide in that match more times than he could count. As for Grand Admiral Alaric Emeries, he smiled and nodded his head in approval at Erich's performance, while watching the live stream with his beautiful young wife sitting in his lap. Alaric shouted in joy as he cheered for Erich's victory. "Well done, kid. Well done. I knew you had it in you." And while the Grand Admiral was excited about the skills Erich had displayed as a starfighter pilot, someone else was just as thrilled as he was while watching the live stream. Erika did not realize it, but at that moment, she was the happiest she had been since she ruined Erich's life several months ago. She did not say a word as she watched the match come to an end. Instead, she simply smiled while eagerly waiting to see the man she once harassed to the point of hopelessness climb to the top of the rankings, and perhaps even win the tournament altogether. Chapter 17 No Surrender. Immediately after emerging victorious in the first round of the Starfighter tournament, Erich was sent into the next one. Like before, the surrounding space was procedurally generated and, because of this, there was no way to truly know just what environment he would be fighting in ahead of time. Unlike the first round, which eliminated over 90% of the contestants, those who survived their battle royal and entered the second round were among the most elite starfighter cadets in the Empire, or were extremely lucky. Either way, Erich could guess that every single one of his opponents would have at least one special ability that was ideal for being a pilot. Because of this, he could not relax and instead kept his head on a swivel as he piloted his starfighter through a dense nebula. While Erich skillfully maneuvered his way through the nebula, his actions were being watched by trillions of people across the Empire, each of which wanting to see what this mutant, who had already caused several controversies, was capable of. However, this time he was not the hunter, instead an opponent had caught his scent and had begun to stalk Erich through the nebula. It was only after a shot from the enemy's laser repeaters hit his rear shield did Erich notice that he was under attack. Via the use of his cyberkinesis, Erich rapidly turned his starfighter around in the middle of the dense nebula and began to dart straight towards his opponent while unleashing both his laser repeaters, along with his plasma cannon in a head-on dogfight. And while 100% of Erich's shots landed on his target, particularly because of his special abilities, the opponent missed more than a few of his own. Thus, as Erich's dagger swept past his rivals, he survived, while the enemy was blown up. Not only had the viewers across the Empire witnessed this daring dogfight, but several of his other opponents did as well, and perhaps in the first time since the tournament had begun, 3 starfighters jointly attacked a single target from separate directions. The shots of both plasma cannons and laser repeaters riddled Erich's shields, quickly reducing their integrity. If Erich did not think of a way to quickly turn the tables, he would not survive this encounter. Thus, it took him all of 3 seconds to calculate the percentage of his 3 opponents' accuracy, based upon the data his shields were reporting. In an act of desperation, he used his cyberkinesis to lower the shields on his left side, which was the area of his ship that was the least likely to sustain serious damage, based upon the enemy's pilot's rate of accuracy, and instead transferred the energy to his rear and right shields, which were bolstered momentarily. While he did this, Erich used his foresight ability to determine the most likely outcome of victory, and after spending no more than a microsecond in the prophetic state, he found there was only one path to survival. Thus, he killed his engine, pretending to have been damaged from the relentless onslaught of his opponents, and allowed them to dart towards him in an attempt to seize victory. Just when the 3 starfighters were about to pass by Erich's starfighter, he dumped some core fuel into his surroundings while maintaining control over it via the extension of his reactor's magnetic fields. From there, he fired a single shot of his plasma cannon into the expelled fuel and shunted all his remaining shield reserves to the front of his ship, anticipating a truly spectacular firework display. The Empire watched in awe at Erich's performance. If not for his ability to control machines with his mind, the maneuver he had just made would have easily cost him his life or, since this was a simulation, his place in the tournament. And yet, the special ability he had continued to stun the audience. While some people, like Grand Admiral Alaric Emery's and the rising pop sensation Erika Krieger, gazed upon the performance as if it were the most brilliant thing they had ever witnessed, others were quick to condemn Erich for his actions. Obviously, they were extremely envious of his abilities, and jealousy brought out the worst in people. Read the latest stories in novelbian.com. Erich had no time to worry about what the livestream of the tournament thought of him, because almost immediately after eliminating the 3 pursuing starfighters, he was set upon by another opponent. After taking several heavy hits from the enemy's plasma cannon, which his shields managed to take, though not without reducing their strength in some areas for a short time, Erich skillfully manipulated his starfighter so that he could get behind the pursuing spacecraft, where he then proceeded to fire an antimatter missile at the bastard. Despite the enemy deploying his countermeasures, the missile was not deterred, specifically because Erich had used his cyberkinesis on it, allowing it to maintain its focus on the enemy starfighter rather than the diversion that was supposed to disrupt its path. The antimatter missile collided with the hull of the hostile starship and blasted it to smithereens. For the rest of the round, Erich would continue to outperform his peers until yet again he managed to pull off an exemplary victory, to which the comments of the tournament's livestream were flooded with a mixture of praise and condemnation. Luckily for Erich, the contestants were given a 1-hour lunch break to eat, drink, and take care of whatever bodily needs were necessary before the semi-finals began. While Erich was fighting for his chance to prove himself the best starfighter cadet in the Empire, the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy was filling out a form that would have a direct impact on Erich's life. Judging by the skills he displayed in the tournament, Erich was already capable enough to join a Special Forces squadron of his choosing. Despite this, Erich's knowledge was all based on simulations. He had no practical experience in the field, thus he would still need to attend flight school, but Grand Admiral Alaric Emery's believed that the young cadet was more than capable of passing with flying colors, and in a fraction of the time it would normally take to do so. Even if Erich did not win this tournament, he had displayed a level of capability with a starfighter that few pilots possessed. It was no wonder the AI had selected the youth for service in the Starfighter Corps, despite the fact that his talents could be proven useful in any number of fields. Thus, Grand Admiral Alaric Emery's was in the act of signing a form, which would seal Erich's fate. Once his signature was signed at the bottom, he looked upon the form, before dialing a number on the Interstellar network, which contacted the supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire. All the while, the footage of Erich's feats in the tournament was being broadcasted in the background. The line connected to reveal the weary face of Hans EPP. The man looked like he had aged 30 years since Erich first entered the academy, and he was clearly in a foul mood as he snapped at his subordinate for calling him out of the blue. "What is it? I am incredibly busy right now. So make it quick." Alaric was quite surprised at the vitriolic reaction he had just received from a man who he considered to be a close friend, and thus, he knew immediately that something serious had occurred in the greater galaxy. As if he had forgotten his reason for calling, a grave expression formed on Alaric's face as he asked the immediate question on his mind. "What's wrong?" Supreme Leader Hans EPP, who was about halfway through a 2-liter bottle of 200 proof whiskey, wiped the umber liquid from the corners of his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket before responding with a grim look in his haggard blue eyes. Nothing could have prepared Alaric for the words he would speak. The Alfheim Dominion's 5th Fleet was destroyed in combat against the Hive Fleet terminus and, as it stands, the Narku are on an exact trajectory for our borders. I reckon it will take them 3 years, at the most, to get through all the civilizations that stand between us and them, and then, well, you know what will happen then. Alaric could immediately understand how the Supreme Leader felt in this moment, and thus he was no longer in the mood to boast about the talents of a promising young cadet who had a bright future ahead of him. Instead, he felt as if he was a man who had just been told he had 3 years to live. Thus, after swallowing the cold air which surrounded him, the Grand Admiral was quick to ask the first question that came to mind. What about the Light Elves? How are they responding to this? Surely they will be sending another fleet to deal with this problem. If they stand by and do nothing, half of their quadrant will be devoured before long. For perhaps the first time since Alaric had met the Supreme Leader, he saw the man openly badmouth the Alfheim Empress, as he spat on the ground and cursed her out with a hint of fury in his ocean blue eyes. The old bitch says that she has more pressing concerns. As a result of the 5th Fleet's destruction, the Dark Elves have begun amassing their military on the border. She believes it will be an all-out war soon enough, and as a result, she cannot spare the men to deal with the Hive Fleet, even if it is rampaging in her quadrant. This was not the most welcome news in the world. In fact, Alaric felt in this moment that he had been dealt a mortal wound as he slid back into his chair, and stared in silence for several moments. After significant effort on his part, he managed to ask a question, one which he already knew the answer to. Then we are on our own? No matter how much he hoped that the Supreme Leader would have some good news for him, it was not destined to come to pass. Instead, Hans took a swig from his bottle and continued to drink until the entire thing was empty, where he immediately nodded his head while responding to the Grand Admiral's question. It would appear that we are. Considering that the Supreme Leader was already drinking his sorrows away, as if the Empire was already defeated, Alaric decided to do the same, as he broke out a bottle of whiskey and began to chug it as if his life depended on it. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, Supreme Leader Hans EPP began to speak up once more, however his expression was utterly lifeless, as if he had lost all reason to live. I suppose we should begin evacuating our society's most elite citizens. Perhaps we can seek asylum on Alfheim. Trillions will die, but at least the foundation of our civilization will live on to rebuild. However, Alaric was not of the same opinion. Instead, he looked utterly offended by the Supreme Leader's covered eyes. He immediately stood up and threw the bottle he held across the room, which flew through the holographic projection of his boss, and shattered against the wall. He was quick to reprimand the most powerful man in the Empire before defying what was clearly not a suggestion, even if it may have sounded like one. Absolutely not. If you wish to evacuate the members of the party, then you are free to do so, but you will not be using any of my naval vessels. We are the Germanic people. Whether it was on Earth or here in the greater galaxy, we have never once backed down in the face of defeat, and we will not do so now. You spineless politicians have forgotten the blood which runs through your veins. We are warriors. There is no enemy in this universe that we fear. So, go ahead. Flee for all I care. But the men of Germania will stand their ground, and if we are to go extinct, then we will have such an end that history will remember our struggle until the end of time itself. I will muster the fleet, where I will spend these next 3 years preparing for the arrival of Narku, and when the enemy enters our borders, we will teach those mindless bugs what it means to be afraid. We will bathe in the blood of our enemies and teach the galaxy a lesson of what it means to have a great race as an enemy. Or we will die trying. There is no other option. After saying this, Alaric hung up on the supreme leader, and immediately contacted the High General of the Imperial Army, and informed the man about the grave news which he had just received, as well as the supreme leader's opinion on the matter. Much like Alaric, the High General was furious that the supreme leader would turn his back on the Empire, and had chosen to die in Germanic space, rather than flee like a coward. Thus, while the entire Empire was watching Erich's performance in the tournaments, the Admiralty began sending out tens of billions of recall orders, reassignments, construction orders, and summons, all just the beginning of what would soon be the largest military campaign of all time, but a seemingly unwinnable challenge is exactly what the German people craved, and they would face it head-on. Chapter 18 Winning the Tournament. While Erich was competing in the semi-finals of the Germanic Star-Empire's Cadet Starfighter tournament, Empress Lunaria Asterion sat upon her throne on the world of Alfheim with a cold expression on her otherwise beautiful face. She was in all honesty surprised at the outcome of the battle between her Fifth Fleet and the Narku Hive Fleet terminus. So much so that she had cancelled all of her plans for the day, and called forth her council of sages, who had rushed forth to meet with their empress. The room was filled with ancient-looking elves, who were so old that their age was visibly displayed on their faces. These primeval members of the species were dressed in emerald green robes, with golden embroidery. For millions of years, these men and women had advised the Asterian dynasty, and now they were once more summoned to do so. With a particularly snarky look on her face, Lunaria called out to the sages, while her youngest daughter, Celestia, stood by her side, with an expression that appeared as if being able to attend this meeting was the greatest honor of her relatively young life. So, it appears that the vision you old foggies spoke of all those years ago has indeed become a reality. The Fifth Fleet has been destroyed, utterly decimated by the Narku Hive Fleet terminus. And, as it stands, those disgusting fucking bugs are headed towards the home of my favorite pups. Realistically speaking, such a young upstart of an interstellar civilization does not have any chance of survival against the Narku. After all, the Germanic Star-Empire's entire navy cannot contend with one of our fleets, and yet the Narku tore the Fifth Fleet to pieces. So tell me, because I desperately want to know, how will they survive against such monstrous beasts if we do not come to their rescue? The head of the Council of Sages stepped forward and bowed before his empress. Despite the respect he showed her, he still thought of the woman as a mere child. After all, she was not even 1,000,000 years old, when compared to a man like himself, who was beyond what many would consider being ancient. She truly was nothing more than a little girl in his eyes. The fact that she had the gall to ask him to explain himself regarding what he had personally seen was among the greatest insults he could receive. If Lunaria's mother was still the empress, then perhaps he would explain in great detail what his vision entailed, but this little girl had no respect for the sages, and thus, he would not deign her with a proper response. You do not need to know the specifics, but we have seen the fate which awaits the Hive Fleet terminus, and by the time of your precious centennial war games, they will be exterminated. The concern you have for your subjects, or puppies as you like to refer to them as, is unfounded. So, do not worry about the Narku, for they are not long for this world. At least not the Hive Fleet known as Terminus. Instead, you should focus your attention on the Svartalfheim Federation, who has perceived the loss of the Rylonian Imperium to be a great weakness on our part, and have thus begun to bare their fangs in response. If we do not respond with strength at the borders, then the Dark Elves will invade our lands and start a war, which will cause the stars to be drenched in blood. I suggest contacting a trade prince from the Kimderi Trade Union, and requesting that they interfere in this dispute, before our rivals realize that we have lost a fleet. Lunaria narrowed her gaze at the head of her council of sages and scoffed before insulting him further. Aceronius, is this the wisdom that you have derived from yet another one of your visions? Find EW chapters on nvlbi.com. The way that the Elven Empress had said the word, visions, clearly displayed her disbelief in what she perceived to be nothing more than old superstitions, which a bunch of conmen had used to claim power in a bygone era. However, Celestia was not of the same opinion as her mother. She took the sage's visions as more fact than fiction, and thus eagerly awaited for the head of the Council of Sages, whose name was Aceronius, to respond to her mother's skepticism. Which he quickly did shortly thereafter, with a smug smile on his aging face. No, my empress. This is the wisdom derived from observation and logic. If you mobilize even more fleets to deal with the Hive Fleet terminus, who, as I already said, are not long for this world, then you will be giving our enemies a chance to invade our borders and annex critical territory. Even if the Kimderi Trade Union interferes after the Dark Elves invade, those bastards will not give up the land they have seized. Thus, after all of my years of experience advising the empresses before you, I believe that it would be most prudent to prevent such a scenario from happening while we still have the opportunity to do so. Do you not agree? Though Lunaria despised being told off by this old charlatan, she had to agree that his reasoning was solid. That was, of course, if his vision turned out to be correct, and the Narku Hive fleet was dealt a fatal blow in ways she could not even imagine. Assuming this was the truth, then indeed, the most prudent option would be to mobilize her forces at the border. Of course, she had already decided on this course of action long before Acaronius had suggested it, and had even informed the supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire of her decision hours before. Why? Because subconsciously she believed that the visions of the sages were real, even if she did not want to admit it because of her agenda. This was why Lunaria put so much emphasis on the Germanic Star-Empire, because the sages had determined they would be a valuable weapon to make use of on the galactic stage, even if it took them millennia to prove themselves as such. Thus, she had decided to invest in the Germanic race as far back as 300 years ago, when she first encountered them. Even if she told herself it was because she found them to be more attractive than her own kind. Still, Lunaria could not help but worry about the fate of the Germanic people, and thus she could only sigh and shake her head while Acaronius drawled on about the threat that the Dark Elves currently posed to her borders. As previously mentioned, she had already decided on sending her fleets to the borders, and thus, after a particularly masterful act of disappointment, she agreed to Acaronius' suggestion. Very well. I have no choice but to send our troops to the border. The Germanic Star-Empire will have to fend for themselves. But if you happen to be wrong, and my precious puppies are exterminated, Acaronius, then I will come for your head. The man simply smiled and nodded his head, utterly confident that the vision he had seen would come to pass, and thus he bowed once more in front of the Empress before departing from the room, but not before leaving one final statement behind. Of course, I expect no less from your majesty. Dash. Erich was screaming with excitement as he scored the last kill in the semi-finals. This was it. One more match, and he would be declared champion. In addition to the 1 million points he would receive for winning the tournament, he had already gained nearly 750,000 points through the many kills he had racked up throughout the various rounds of the competition. Which meant that he should easily be ranked the top of the Academy's leaderboard if he won this tournament. Not to mention the 250,000 credit prize pool, which was enough to either buy him a large villa on a frontier world, or a small starship. All that was left was a 1v1 with the other best pilot in the cadre of cadets that existed across the Empire. Thus, as the countdown made its way to 0 and the match began, Erich felt as if he was on the top of the world. Upon entering the combat zone, Erich realized that he was in yet another asteroid field, which he maneuvered through with exceptional skill. Not only had he pushed the engines to the maximum, but he had even used his cyberkinesis to add an extra 20% to his top speed, allowing him to transcend the limits which the fighter was designed to achieve, though it did put some stress on the engines and hull of the starfighter. Before long, a blip appeared on his sensors, and Erich knew the final showdown was about to begin. He quickly pursued the enemy pilot, who appeared to wield his starfighter almost as if it were an extension of his body. This bewildered not only Erich, but the entire audience who was watching the live stream. It was clear both of these men had cyberkinesis, and thus would be an even match. Or so everyone thought. However, Erich was not a single enhanced German, nor was he a double enhanced German. No, he was an extremely rare triple enhanced German, meaning he had 3 abilities, and thus he began to harass the other pilot with his mind, as he cursed him out. Hey, asshole, just so you know, after I've defeated you in this tournament, I'm going to find your mother and your sisters and fuck them all in front of you. Once all of your female relatives are pregnant with my children, I will force you to father them in my place. Clearly this remark had gotten on his opponent's nerves, who began to fire upon Erich as the two played a game of chicken with one another. However, Erich had other plans, and quickly maneuvered his starfighter around in a way which avoided the shots, while firing his own laser repeaters at the enemy. The two men had both missed one another, as they appeared equal in skill, causing Erich to continue to speak vile and grotesque words towards his opponent in an attempt to throw him off his game. However, the rival pilot turned out to be a double-enhanced human and responded to Erich's insults by hurling asteroids with him via his telekinesis. These asteroids were large enough to turn Erich's starfighter into a heap of scrap metal, and thus Erich quickly found himself at a disadvantage as he was forced to dodge both the weapon on board the enemy's starfighter and the dangerous environment. Quickly finding himself on the defensive, Erich was forced to use his third and final ability, as he gazed 7 seconds into the future in search of an opening. Which he found, but if he was off by just a millisecond, it would mean that he would be the one to suffer a defeat. With a heavy sigh, Erich pushed his joystick forward and boosted his speed to the maximum setting while flying straight at the enemy pilot. At first, the guy thought Erich was playing another game of chicken, and thus, he chuckled as he continued to fire his shots at Erich while also throwing more asteroids at him. 5 seconds had gone by, and Erich showed no sign of breaking off, and yet, the hostile pilot did not dare break off, and instead continued to pilot his ship directly at the mutant who dared to insult his family. Finally, just before the two ships were about to crash into one another, Erich pulled the eject feature on his seat, and shot himself into space, while his starfighter collided directly into the hostile pilot, killing him instantly, and ending the virtual reality tournament once and for all in Erich's favor. The entirety of the Germanic Star-Empire, or at least the trillions of citizens who had watched the live stream, gazed in astonishment at what Erich had done. Seeing that he had no chance to overcome the enemy's combined attacks, Erich had sacrificed his ship to earn a kill. It was entirely unthinkable for most pilots. Considering once you ejected, you would be stranded in space until someone picked you up, and if your flight suit was damaged in the process, you could face certain death. But because it was a simulation, this was not a factor, and thus, Erich had achieved a victory, thus earning himself the 1 million points and the 250,000 credits. Out of everyone who was watching the broadcast, perhaps nobody had a wider smile on their face than the up-and-coming idol Erika Krieger, who shouted out in joy after seeing the man she had previously harassed to the point of hopelessness win the tournament. Chapter 19: Graduating from the Academy. Since winning the tournament, all eyes had begun to pry into Erich's daily life. Especially on campus, where fellow cadets would watch as the silver-haired young man did everything in his power to increase the divide between himself and the other high-ranking students. He, like everyone else in the Empire, was blissfully unaware of the threat which the Germanic Star-Empire would soon be facing. At the moment, Supreme Leader Hans EPP was currently engaging in a conversation with the Alfheim Empress, who had taken time out of her busy schedule to accept his call. The look on her beautiful face was one of concern, as the man voiced the two diverging viewpoints that the political party and the military now had on how they should deal with the Narku threat, which was rapidly approaching their borders. It is my intention to escape from this sinking ship while I still can with those of our empire who are most capable of restoring civilization once the Narku High Fleet has been dealt with. I intend to take the most elite of my people's society and have them evacuate to our embassy on your homeworld. However, it would appear that both the Grand Admiral and the High General have other plans. They intend to stand and fight until the last man. They have no intentions of fleeing, instead, they are now drawing upon every resource to expand our military prowess and bolster the lines of defense against Terminus. It is because of this that they are not even willing to provide our party members with an armed escort to Alfheim. Thus, I am afraid that I must request that you personally see to it that the greatest members of our race are ferried off to your home world, where we will be able to survive the coming catastrophe and rebuild from amongst the ashes. Lunaria gazed at Hans with a peculiar look on her face. Hans had always been a practical man. If all hope was lost, then he would flee and return to fight another day. Normally this was a personality trait that the Light Elven Empress would admire in her vassals. However, the sole purpose she had for fostering the Germanic Star-Empire was because of their use as a weapon of war. If they were not going to even fight for their own homeland, then what purpose did she have for them? Luckily for her, there were those that agreed with her mentality within Germanic society, who intended to go out with a last stand against an enemy that even the Alfheim Dominion feared. This mentality of do or die was rare in the galaxy. Most, if not all, species would agree with Hans' decision to take the best of their society and flee to a safer region of space, but not Lunaria. She could not help but get excited at the idea of her warhounds fighting against all odds, against a superior opponent, hoping that at the very least they could inflict a mortal wound upon their foe with the death of their civilization. If not for the fact that the Svartalfheim Federation was now pressing on her borders, she would be more than happy to dispatch her own forces to aid the Germanic Star-Empire in their heroic last stand. However, she simply could not afford to do so at the moment, and thus she could only admire the resolve of men like the Grand Admiral and the High General, which she was quick to voice, much to the chagrin of the Supreme Leader. While I am more than willing to spare a few corvettes to safely escort your people to Alfheim, I can't help but admire the resolve that your military has. I must say, few species would be more willing to die in battle rather than flee in cowardice. It is a shame that such a valuable asset will be reduced to nothing. But make no mistake, I shall host what remains of your species here on Alfheim until a time when you can reclaim your lost territory. As for how you rebuild, that will be up to your discretion. Though Hans did not take kindly to Lunaria's comments about his actions being one of cowardice, he still forced a smile and bowed his head respectfully to the Alfheim Empress before ending the call. I thank you for your benevolence. When we return to the position of power we once held in the galaxy, I assure you that we will do everything in our power to repay the favor we owe you. Having said this, the call ended, and Lunaria could not help but scoff before voicing her true thoughts aloud, knowing that nobody was around to hear her. At that point, only the cowards among your race will have survived, and without a doubt it will affect your gene pool. If that is the case, then I will have no use for the dregs that you will become. Instead, my thoughts and prayers are with those brave men who stay behind, knowing that they will die horribly against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with. Dash. While the supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire was doing everything in his power to begin the evacuation of those he considered being essential to the reconstruction of his great society, Grand Admiral Alaric au Emeries and the High General Hermann Hartmann were busy preparing for the eventual invasion by the Narku High Fleet. Every aspect of society was being diverted to the war effort. Reservists were being called back into active service, fortifications were being built, and new weapons were being manufactured. In 3 years' time, the Germanic Star-Empire planned to increase the total number of fleets under their command from 100 to 150. In order to man these new fleets, they had not only recalled all reservists to active duty, but they had also lowered the age of conscription to 16. Meaning that now high school students were being called to serve in the ranks of the enlisted. Naturally, society had begun to speculate why such drastic measures were being taken, to which the Grand Admiral announced to the public his plan to expand the borders of the Germanic Star-Empire, via the invasion and annexation of its neighbors. Of course, he conveniently managed to leave out the information regarding terminus. Though the Germanic Star-Empire had begun the mobilization of its armed forces to conquer their neighbors, they did not intend to incorporate these other worlds and species into the empire. In reality, Alaric intended to vassalize these civilizations and use them as a buffer to hold off the Narku High Fleet terminus for as long as possible. Thus, at the moment, Alaric was in a conversation with the High General of the Imperial Army, a man named Hermann Hartmann, as he discussed his plan to lower the training restrictions on active duty servicemen. By now, the technology we have to simulate combat is so advanced that there is not nearly as much need for practical training. To put it simply, I do not intend to waste 2 years putting my starfighter pilots, who have just graduated from the academy, into dedicated flight schools. These men should already know how to pilot a starfighter long before they enter active service, and all they really need is a crash course to become accustomed to the real world. I am doing the same for all combat-related fields in the Navy. Thus, I suggest you follow my example and lower the time required to complete specialized training programs. With this, we may be able to increase the number of active duty officers deployed to combat zones, which will be required if we wish to establish a proper buffer zone before the Narku arrive. Surprisingly, Alaric did not receive any argument from Hermann, who simply nodded his head in agreement before expressing his thoughts on the matter. I completely agree. Now is not the time to ensure that our soldiers are the most proficient in their tasks as they can possibly be. Rather, now is the time to ensure that we have bodies on the battlefield. Men who are already experienced in combat by the time the Narku arrive at our borders. Thus, it is my recommendation that effective immediately we have on-the-job specialized training. With the heads of the 2 military branches in agreement on this matter, there was nothing standing in their way from changing the current training standards. And though this may result in a decrease in overall proficiency among their soldiers, it was not by much. In return for this concession, the Germanic Star-Empire would be able to churn out new officers and enlisted personnel significantly quicker than before. Months passed since Erich first won the tournament, and finally the day for his graduation had come. By now he was already aware that the extended flight school was cut from a 2-year program to 3 months. In fact, every cadet was made aware of this change the moment it was announced. Not only would Erich be going to the most elite flight school in the Empire, but he would be graduating at the rank of lieutenant while serving in the elite Black Sun Squadron. He had been informed of this reality only 2 weeks ago. And while every other member of Erich's graduating class had invited their families to attend the event, Erich himself was left alone. This did not matter to him too much because as the top student, he was commanded to give a speech to his peers, something he did not wish for his mother to see, in fear that he might bungle it. After spending the morning sitting through the initial stages of the graduation ceremony, Erich now stood on the stage, at a podium, where he began to recite the speech he had long since prepared for his graduating class. Today is a day that we all must celebrate. Our youth is behind us, and now that we are men, it is our duty to protect the empire from the infinite number of threats which lie beyond our borders. War is a part of our people's history, going back to the days of Earth, where for millennia we fought tooth and nail against an entire world for our place upon it. Violence is in our blood. It is part of our nature, something which no Germanic man can deny. Thus, it is fate that as we take our first steps into the world of men, we must also take up arms to defend our homes and our families. Some of you, like myself, will go on to serve in combat roles, while others will be supporting those of us who must kill for our great race. Whatever position you find yourself in, remember that you are a soldier in the Empire's military and must conduct yourself with the honor and dignity that we as a species admire above all else. Glory to the Empire! Glory to Germania! The crowd broke out into applause after hearing Erich's speech, where he proceeded to accept his diploma before stepping down from the stage and entering the crowd of cadets which had gathered below. He waited for each man to receive his diploma, where they proceeded to celebrate by throwing their caps into the air. After which, someone he thought he would never see again in his life approached Erich. At first, the young man believed his eyes were deceiving him, until the beautiful woman wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him on the forehead. Erich, my baby boy, I am so proud of you. I wish I could have given you more support this past year, but your father has been keeping a close eye on me. I barely managed to make it to your graduation without him noticing. It shames me to admit that I can't stay for much longer, but I just wanted to let you know that even after everything you did, Mommy still loves you and is supporting you from behind the scenes. After saying this, Krista disappeared into the crowd as quickly as she had appeared, leaving Erich to wonder if he had actually seen his mother, or if it was just a figment of his imagination. If not for the fact that he still felt the wetness of his mother's lips on his forehead, then Erich would have no proof that the woman had really come to see him. Visit Envelben.cm for EW ovals. But this was neither here nor there. For by the end of the day, Erich would be shipping off to the 13th Fleet, where he would begin his on-the-job training with the most elite Special Forces squadron the Imperial Navy had at its disposal. Chapter 20 Black Sun Squadron. That evening, Erich and his friends had begun to say their goodbyes. Over the last 2 years, these young men had known and supported each other through their daily lives in the academy. Thus, they had gathered after their graduation at their favorite cafe, where they each drank the daily limit of beer they were legally permitted to consume. With bitter expressions on their faces, the friends exchanged information about where they were headed to now that they had officially begun their mandatory military service. Erich was the first to voluntarily speak about this matter. Well, I'm off to the 13th Fleet to serve with the Black Sunday. What about you guys? Where are you headed? Carl took a large swig from his beer before wiping the foam from his mouth. He was not surprised in the slightest that a pilot as capable as Erich would be serving among the elite ranks of the Special Forces, and was thus quick to congratulate the man while giving him some particularly juicy information. Congrats man, after all the hard work you have put through, you earned it. I am also headed to the 13th Fleet. Though I will not be on board one of the carriers like you, instead I will be stationed in the engine room of a destroyer. Who knows, maybe if I prove myself capable in the coming years, I will be transferred to serve on board your carrier. Unlike Erich, Carl and the others were all in support roles. Carl was an engineering officer, while Dolph was a tactical officer, and as for Frederick, he was a bridge officer. Dolph was surprised that 2 of his friends had been sent to the same fleet, to which he was quick to lament his own position. I'll be serving on a fucking frigate in the 25th Fleet, which, in case you bastards don't already know, that means that I will primarily be stationed on Vinland. All 3 of the other men grimaced when they heard this news. Vinland was a tundra planet, or one nearly inhospitable to life, with only scarce mosses growing. And while the Germanic people were heavily resistant to the cold, it was still not ideal for any of these men who had spent the last 2 years in a reasonably warm climate. Erich could only laugh as he heard his friend's position, before reminding him just how badly he had it. Yeah, well, it could be worse. You could be sent to the 13th Fleet, which isn't stationed on any single planet. We literally roam the borders of the Empire looking for things to fight, and that's when we are not deployed to an actual war zone. I will spend the next 20 years of my life primarily in space. As for Carl, he is lucky that he is an engineering officer, because he only has to serve 8 to 10 years. Carl shook his head when he heard this. Naturally he was made aware of this information, when he was informed of which unit he would be serving with. To think that the 2 of them would spend the next decade or more of their lives in the vacuum of space. It was truly lamentable. While Erich, Carl, and Dolph were all competing for who had it worse, Frederick was laughing at the miserable bastards. Not only was he a bridge officer, which was the least likely role to result in a casualty, but he was also stationed in the best fleet of them all, which he was quick to brag about in a particularly loathsome way. Follow EW stories at nv.com. You are all going to hate me for this, but take a guess which fleet I have been assigned to, and what type of ship. Erich could already tell by the smug look on the man's face that he had gotten a pretty comfortable position, and thus he gave his best guess, one which he thought was damn near impossible to be correct. I'm guessing that you have been assigned to the first fleet as the bridge officer on a carrier. Frederick was quite surprised to see Erich guess correctly, and was quick to ask just how the man had found out. How the hell did you know? All 3 of Frederick's best friends immediately exclaimed in disbelief and had practically pulled the man out of his booth and assaulted him in an act of fury. What? No fucking way. You miserable cunt. How? How did you get that position? Fuck you. What did this mean? Well, the first fleet found itself stationed on a world smack dab in the middle of the empire that was known to be a tropical paradise. It was called Teutonia. Not only was the world a comfortable deployment, but the fact that Frederick was the bridge officer on board a carrier meant that the entire fleet would be protecting his ass, giving him a secure and comfortable position, even when sent into combat. Frederick merely laughed at his friend's misfortune, while basking in his own good luck, and continued to do so for the remainder of the time they had together. However, when the hour struck 6 in the evening, the four men shook hands, saluted, and then said their farewells. With Erich in particular looking back on his life at the university with fondness. Well, gentlemen, it has been fun. But all good things must come to an end. I hope to see you all alive and well in 20 years. If I should receive a permanent death fighting against the Empire's enemies, then all I request is that you pour a litter for me in respect for the fallen at my funeral, even if though there likely won't be a body to bury. The three men agreed to Erich's request before bidding farewell, where each of them boarded a different transport ship, all bound for the vessels they had been assigned to. After saying his farewells, it did not take Erich long to arrive at the 13th Fleet, where he and the rest of the new recruits reported to their duty stations. During times of peace, the Empire's naval structure was split into two different categories of fleets: roaming fleets and stationary fleets. A roaming fleet was exactly what it sounded like. It was tasked with roaming the borders of the Empire and eliminating the enemies which managed to find themselves within their borders. While stationary fleets were dispatched to the 36 star systems of the Empire and remained within the system as a part of its defenses. Considering the Empire was currently mustering its strength for war, the 13th Fleet had been assigned to an armada of 9 other fleets, all of which were currently located in this one-star system on the fringes of the Empire. Each fleet is composed of well over 100 warships. In addition, there were several support ships which were attached to the fleet as well. Meaning that at this moment, there were over 1,000 naval vessels currently within the space of this system. Despite the overwhelming size of naval power located within this system, Erich quickly found his way to the carrier which he was assigned to, where he quickly made his way to his living quarters. After finding the bunks where the starfighter pilots slept, Erich tossed his duffel bag into his personal quarters, before being introduced to the rest of his unit. One man in particular, who appeared a bit too muscular to be a pilot, was quick to greet the newest member of the Black Sunday. He was dressed in a solid black flight suit, whose only color was the red, white, and black flag emblazoned on his right biceps. This was strange to Erich, who was certain that the flight suits of GSE pilots were a dark grey, not a jet black. "Oh, Silber, are you the new lieutenant?" When Erich heard his old nickname, which was a reference to his hair and eye color, he knew that the term his old classmates had used to mock him had just become his call sign. Thus, with a heavy sigh, he nodded his head and saluted the large man who wore the insignia of a lieutenant commander. "Yes, sir." Despite what Erich had initially thought, the lieutenant commander simply chuckled and patted Erich on the back before assuring him that he did not need to refer to him so formally at a time like this. "Relax, kid, you are in the Starfighter Corps now. We tend to be a lot less formal than the rest of the cunts in the Navy. I'm Totenkov and I've been ordered to help you get accustomed to your new starfighter. Get dressed in your flight suit, and meet me in the hangar bay ASAP." Erich instinctively responded in the affirmative, just like he had done mere seconds before. "Yes, sir." After saying this, Erich found a jet black flight suit, just like the one that the Totenkov was wearing in his cot, along with a helmet and a life support system. He quickly adorned everything he needed to pilot his new starfighter, aside from the helmet, which he held beneath his arm as he sprinted to the flight deck. Upon entering the flight deck, Erich noticed a variety of starcraft. Whether they were fighters, bombers, interceptors, or perhaps even gunships. The carrier managed to hold hundreds, if not thousands, of ships inside its interior. All the ships, except for a select few, were painted in a dark grey. Those that weren't were the ships of the Black Sun Squadron, which were painted in a solid jet black. Thus, it was easy to navigate to the proper area, where he saw the lieutenant commander waiting for his arrival. Erich quickly attached his helmet, whose visor was as black as the flight suit, before climbing into his cockpit. Though he had no way of knowing it, the moment he equipped his helmet, a blood-red holographic projection of a skull appeared on his jet-black visor. This was a feature that only Special Forces squadrons had attached to their uniforms. Erich could hear the voice of the lieutenant commander whose call sign was Totenkov call out to him as he asked the recruit if he was accustomed to piloting this particular starfighter. "Are you familiar with the controls of an interceptor? These bolts are extremely fast, more so than your standard dagger. They also have stealth capabilities, so it would be best if you started off slowly." Erich had limited experience training with the interceptor known as the Bolt. Like Totenkov had said, it was capable of breakneck speeds and was designed to intercept and eliminate enemy starfighters and bombers before they could reach the fleet. But he was a capable pilot and was quick to acclimate to the sudden change in his environment. After receiving permission to take off, the two interceptors took to the space outside of the fleet as they conducted a few drills. Despite being a fresh out of the academy, Erich piloted his starfighter in a way that impressed even Totenkov, who called out to him over their comms with a hint of shock in his tone. "God damn, you're a natural, Silber. I guess there is a reason they stuck you in our squadron, after all. Alright, that's enough showing off. Let's head back to the flight deck now that I know what you are capable of. Erich did not argue with the lieutenant commander, and quickly landed in the hangar bay of the carrier, where he climbed out of his cockpit, and met with the rest of his unit who had gathered to watch the recruit get schooled by Totenkov only to be surprised at his capabilities as a pilot. In fact, the commander in charge of the squadron quickly approached Erich and shook his hand, before introducing himself with a smile on his face. That's some damn fine flying, kid. I see now why the brass sent you to our unit. Most new recruits wash out pretty quickly, and are sent back down to the minor leagues for not meeting our standards. But if you keep that up, you will be deployed to the battlefield before you know it. I'm Commander Erwin Wolf, by the way, but these idiots just called me Wolf Sangel. Erich shook the commander's hand and introduced himself, surprised that thus far nobody had bothered to give him shit about being a mutant. Lieutenant Erich Jaeger reporting for duty, but I suppose most people just call me Silber. Shockingly, this comment made the commander laugh, but there was no malice behind his words. I can see why. Alright Silber, welcome to the Black Sunday. Get comfortable, because in case you have not been informed already, you have got 2 weeks to get up to speed before we go to war. This news shocked Erich, as he was informed that he would still be required to undergo 3 months of specialized training, which he was quick to ask about. With all due respect, sir, I was informed that I would not see a battlefield for at least 3 months. What changed? In response to this, the commander's eyes narrowed before he sighed heavily. In that moment, he revealed something to Erich with a whisper so that only the members of the Black Sun could hear him. I'll level with you, kid. Normally you would get 2 years of flight school before ever being assigned to this unit. However, due to recent developments, that time has been slashed down to 3 months of on-the-job training. Like I am sure you are already aware. And the best way to learn while on the job is through combat. It is time to sink or swim the Silber. Now what I'm about to say absolutely needs to stay between our unit. I don't know whether you should be thankful for your new security clearance, or sorry. There is no easy way to say this, but within 3 to 5 years, the Narku High Fleet terminus will be at our borders. The politicians have already begun to abandon us, and are headed to Alfheim in search of refuge from the coming catastrophe. Meanwhile, the military has determined that we, as a species, will fight to the last man, even if it means the death of our civilization. Thus, in 2 weeks, we will be declaring war on our neighbors in order to create a buffer zone between us and the fucking bugs. Thus, your on-the-job training will be conducted on the battlefield. Luckily for you, you already appear to have the hang of things, so your odds of survival are significantly higher than most of these new pilots. Erich stared at the commander in disbelief for a very long time. What he had just been told was that the world was essentially coming to an end. That the extinction of his entire species was imminent, and that he would be on the front lines of war against the Narku. Except this time around, he was not in a simulation. Chapter 21 Declaration of War. Life on board the carrier was not the most comfortable existence which Erich could imagine. During his years at the Naval Academy, Erich had his own dorm room, which was essentially a studio apartment with everything he needed to be happy. However, life on the carrier was entirely different. He lived out of a small bunk in a room with over a dozen different pilots. He would not only have to shower with these men at the same time, but would also eat his meals in the mess hall, which had no variety to speak of. Instead, they were designed entirely with nutrition in mind. Essentially, he had been reduced from a solitary existence to communal living in the span of a day. But humans were adaptable creatures, and the Germanic race was especially more so than baseline humans, due to the centuries of genetic enhancements which they had received, as well as those enhancements which the nanites in their bloodstream gave them. Thus, Erich had no problem adjusting to this sudden shift in his life. If there was one benefit which he received, it was that within a mere 2 weeks, he became quite friendly with his fellow pilots. The members of the Black Sun almost always referred to each other by their call signs, so much so that Erich did not even know the actual names of half of his comrades. Like he had expected, Erich was quickly stuck with the call sign of Silber, but it was no longer a derogatory term designed to insult him for his appearance. Instead it was a name filled with the spirit of camaraderie, and as Erich continued to perform missions around the Armada, which was comprised of 10 whole fleets and more than 1,000 naval vessels, he had rapidly earned the respect of his unit. But the peaceful days of flying escort missions and patrol operations quickly came to an end, as within 2 weeks, war was declared on a neighboring civilization. The target of the Germanic Star-Empire's ire was a minor power known as the Dvrakia Consortium, which was located approximately 300 light-years away from the borders of the GSE. The species was humanoid, and in many ways resembled the mythological and biblical demons of yore. Your standard Dvrakia stood at approximately 1.5 meters tall, and had blood-red skin, large vampire-like fangs, bat-like wings, 2 curled horns, and a succubus-like tail. They also had sharp claws on their hands and feet, and long serpent-like forked tongues. though they may appear sinister due to the myths propagated on Earth centuries ago, the Dvrakians were actually quite peaceful, renowned in their sector of the galaxy for never starting a war, and only defending themselves. And while they were somewhat pacifistic, they still kept a large military for defensive purposes. However, in the eyes of the hungry wolf that was the Germanic Star-Empire, these devil-like pacifists were easy prey. Thus, after precisely 2 weeks of active service, Erich watched on the grid as the Grand Admiral declared war on the Dvrakia consortium. Grand Admiral Emery stood on a balcony where below him were millions of Germanic Star Marines dressed in their power armor as they stood at attention, waiting for the man to give his speech. Since the dawn of our race, war has been an aspect of our lives which we have never shied away from. No, we the Germanic people embrace conflict as a matter of pride. Seldom have we ever needed to justify a war, and though I may not need to do so to my own people, there are those in the galaxy who get antsy when an upstart like the Germanic Star-Empire begins expanding at the expense of their neighbors. But conquest needs no justification. It is a natural part of life. Those with strength and power expand at the expense of the weak. That is the way of the universe and always has been. Make no mistake, my brothers, our neighbors to the east are very weak. What right do they have to dwell on their many worlds, with all their resources, while we, the strong, struggle to meet the demands of our ever-growing population? Might makes right. And we, the Germanic people, do not need to justify our actions to those who do not have the strength to oppose our will. And so as of today, I, the Grand Admiral of the Germanic Star-Empire, declare on behalf of our Supreme Leader, that we will be invading and conquering the Dvrakia consortium, so that our people have the living space which they need to survive and thrive in this harsh universe. Hail victory! Immediately after hearing this rousing speech, the millions of Star Marines who stood at attention below the balcony raised their right arms into the air as they saluted the Grand Admiral before repeating his last words back to him. Hail victory! This declaration of war was not only broadcasted across the Germanic Star-Empire, but throughout the entire quadrant which the Alfheim Dominion ruled over. And while the speech Grand Admiral Emery's had given managed to rally his people to arms, it had only served as a source of anger to those civilizations who believed that a proper casus belli was needed for the declaration of war. After all, most civilizations did not believe that conquest itself was a proper justification for war. On the homeworld of the Dvrakia consortium, a beautiful young woman of the Dvrakia race gazed in horror at the broadcast, which was currently being live-streamed from the Germanic Star-Empire. As a minor power, they had no hope of winning a war with a regional power, especially one as vicious and violent as the Germanic race. The only hope her species had for survival was to gain the aid of their allies. Because of this, she pled to her father, who was the president of the Dvrakia consortium, to call upon his friends to support him in his hour of need. Father, you must have seen the broadcast by now, those barbarians will soon be at our gates. We do not have the military strength necessary to defend our borders from a regional power like the Germanic Star-Empire. Everyone knows that those savages expand their borders through the conquest and extermination of other life forms. If we are to be defeated, then the enemy will conduct a genocide that will wipe out our entire species. You must send for aid. The president of the Dvrakia consortium sighed heavily as he listened to his daughter's concerns. He knew as well as anyone in this galaxy what kind of vicious beasts the Germanic people turned into when they went to war. They had no regard for life other than their own, and this was displayed in the brutal way in which they engaged in combat. Knowing that the survival of his species was on the line, the president nodded his head in agreement with his daughter's words, though he feared that it would not be enough to stem the tide. Very well. I will contact our allies and request aid for the upcoming war. With this said, the Dvrakia president immediately contacted the regional power which had vassalized them. Unlike the Dvrakians, who appeared to be the physical incarnation of demons, the regional power, which were their masters, appeared as if they were angels. With pale white skin, long golden hair, matching eyes, and large fluffy wings. The Enochian theocracy were as beautiful and as majestic as the angels of the Christian religion. The high priestess of the Enochian theocracy had a disturbed look on her face, as she spoke to the holographic projection of the Dvrakia president. Before the demonic-looking creature could plead for help, the Enochian raised her dainty hand and spoke in an angelic voice. I already know about your concerns, and I assure you that our fleets are already en route to your borders. These barbarians have dared to attack our subjects without proper cause, and thus we have no choice but to retaliate. His chapter is update by NV, Bind.com. I won't lie to you, Daxxaus. Though the Germanic Star-Empire is a small nation, their military strength is on par with a Tier 3 regional power. Thus, I have called upon all of my vassals to respond to this unholy attack on the faithful. However, I must warn you, the Germanic Star-Empire is a direct vassal of the Alfheim Dominion, and has won many wars with civilizations more powerful than themselves. It is because of this that I cannot guarantee victory in this conflict. If worst comes to worse, you may flee to the Enochian theocracy with the surviving members of your race. This was not the news that Daxxas and his daughter, Vanta, were hoping to hear. Though they were glad to receive military aid from their suzerain and allies, they realized now, after hearing the words of their master, that they would need to prepare for the worst-case scenario. While the Germanic Star-Empire had begun mustering its armadas to invade their neighbors, the Empress of the Alfheim Dominion watched from the sidelines on her homeworld with a particularly joyful smile on her flawless face. This reaction had only caused her youngest daughter, Celestia, to react in concern. Especially after she heard her mother's words. Magnificent, aren't they? Not even a 7-nation army can hold back the Germanic Star-Empire. Perhaps if they were going against a subgalactic power, and 6 regional powers, then they would be defeated. But a mere tier 2 regional power, and their minor vassals? These fools don't have a chance at victory. Still, that was very bold of Grand Admiral Emery's, to declare war without a proper justification. Without a doubt, he has ruffled more than a few feathers among the subgalactic powers, don't you think so, my dear Celestia? Celestia stared at her mother's satisfied expression as if she were looking at a mad woman, before questioning just what was so exciting about this whole ordeal. Mother, I don't understand. Shouldn't the Germanic Star-Empire be focusing on bolstering their defenses? After all, they are aware, or at least the highest echelons of their government are aware, that the Narku are only a few years away from their borders. So why waste valuable resources in a conflict with their neighbors? Expansion seems like a foolish idea during such a time of crisis. Lunaria did not comment for several seconds before she sighed heavily, almost as if she was disappointed with her daughter for not seeing the real reason the Germanic Star-Empire had begun to expand its borders, thus she lectured Celestia with a particularly agitated tone. Because Celestia, they do not intend to actually conquer and exterminate the Dvrakians, at least not yet. No, the Germanic Star-Empire intends to use the Dvrakia Consortium as a buffer against the Narku. Not only will they arm the Dvrakians and train them to be more effective combatants, but they will also fortify the worlds, so that Terminus will have to slog their way through hundreds of systems of brutal combat, and thus weakening their high fleet, until finally they have to face off against a fully rested Germanic military. Every single Dvrakia will die fighting on behalf of their new overlords, thus freeing up their territory for Germanic expansion. And they will take down as many of those fucking bugs as they can. The GSE isn't just planning for their survival, but for their expansion as well. It is truly an inspiring sight to behold. After hearing her mother's wisdom, Celestia felt as if she had gained a new understanding of the Germanic people and their goals. And perhaps Celestia was beginning to understand her mother's borderline obsession with her favorite pets. Thus, she smiled and nodded her head in agreement with her mother's words, hoping to watch how the Germanic Star-Empire would manage to survive, if that was even possible. Chapter 22 Guaranteed Victory. The war had begun, and Erich quickly found himself on the front lines. Against a minor power like that Dvrakia Consortium, it would normally take the Germanic Star-Empire a few months to achieve total victory. After all, it was not like minor powers had access to fortress worlds which would prolong the suffering that the Germanic military would have to endure during their conquest. However, because the Dvrakia Consortium had managed to rope their suzerain and allies into the war, it was unknown how long this war would last. In fact, it was actually a gamble on the part of the Admiralty, because if they could win the war within a year, then it vastly increased their chances of survival against Terminus, while if they failed to accomplish this objective, it vastly increased their odds of extinction. Of course, Erich did not need to concern himself with the thoughts of the Admiralty. Instead, he needed to focus on one thing, and one thing alone. Destroying the enemy in front of him. At the moment Erich was in his Bolt Interceptor as it zipped through the combat zone, outside of a Dvrakia border world, where the first armora of the Imperial Navy fought against a combined force of the Dvrakia Navy and their allies. This was Erich's first time experiencing actual combat, and because of that he had so much adrenaline running through his veins he might as well be a meth addict. Of course, this was not just a matter of natural adrenaline production, but the result of adrenal stimulants which were injected into his body via his flight suit from the moment he took off from the hangar bay. There was a wide grin on Erich's face, which was obscured by his obsidian black visor, which projected an image of a bright red human skull on its surface. If the enemy were to gaze upon his appearance at this moment, they might be intimidated. Luckily for them, they could not see the frightening uniform which displayed Erich's status as a member of the most elite starfighter squadron in the Imperial Navy. Erich continued to navigate through the battlefield with masterful skill as he spotted his first target, which was chasing after an Imperial dagger. He quickly gunned his engines and shot after the hostile fighter at breakneck speeds, whereupon lining up the sights of his targeting array, Erich pulled the trigger on his joystick, thus sending a rain of laser and plasma projectiles at his opponent. The laser and plasma projectiles ate through the primitive energy shields of the Dvrakia starfighter, and ignited the entire vehicle, causing it to explode in a matter of seconds. Though Erich could not see the face of the man he just killed, he felt a bit of excitement flood his heart and mind, as he was now a true veteran pilot. A voice spoke through Erich's helmet, which he quickly identified as the lieutenant commander in charge of his wing, known primarily by the call sign, Totenkopf. "Nice one, Silber, but make sure to watch your six." After saying this, Totenkopf fired an antimatter missile which detonated against the hull of an Enochian starfighter which was tailing Erich from behind. Seeing that he almost got shot down after only a single kill, Erich began to focus his attention on his surroundings, as much as what was in front of him, where he quickly found an enemy bomber heading towards the destroyer which Karl was stationed on. Seeing that a friend of his might be in danger, Erich gunned after the enemy bomber, and began to light up its frame with his laser repeaters, rapidly whittling down its shields until they were depleted, where he fired an antimatter missile at it. Though the enemy deployed his countermeasures, such a petty trick would not work against Erich's missiles. After all, he had the power to manipulate machines with his mind, and thus he personally guided the missile into its target with his thoughts. As the bomber exploded, Erich cheered before cursing out the man he had just killed. "Take that, you red bastard. Thinking of killing Karl, fat chance." Dash. While the battle continued to rage on above the world of Theracles, in which Erich was a participant, the high priestess of the Enochian Empire was sitting on her home world with an expression of disbelief on her face. It was as if the sky was falling on top of her, and she could not understand just how her enemies had managed to become so powerful in such a short amount of time. How? How is this possible? The Germanic Star-Empire had surprised their enemies with a navy so large, they might as well be a subgalactic power. The Germanic navy had 10 armadas, which were each composed of 10 fleets, each of which had a minimum of 100 warships among its ranks. A single armada of the Imperial Navy contained at least 1,000 warships, which was more than all the Enochian theocracy's vassals combined. The High Priestess had sent the entire power of her vassals, as well as a quarter of her naval strength to the world of Theracles in its defense, and yet the Germanic Star-Empire had only sent 1/10 of its naval strength, and despite this was already close to emerging victorious. Where were the other 9 armadas of the Germanic Star-Empire at this moment? Well, 2 of them were guarding their borders, while the other 6 were dispatched to the Enochian theocracy and its other 6 vassals. While the vassals of the Enochian theocracy had sent their entire navies to the Dvrakia consortium, they had left themselves wide open for an attack by the Germanic Star-Empire. Never in their wildest dreams would they have believed that such a young upstart of a nation would have the strength to fight a 7-nation army without even breaking a sweat. It was truly maddening. While the High Priestess of the Enochian theocracy scrambled what ships she could manage to fight against the invasion of her enemies, she immediately opened up her hailing frequency to contact the supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire. However, for whatever reason, it was not Hans who answered the call, but the Grand Admiral who had declared war in the first place. This was shocking to the High Priestess, who could only assume that a coup had taken place in the Germanic Star-Empire. Regardless if this was true, she needed to end this war before half of her civilization was destroyed in this foolish conflict. "Call off your fleets from the Enochian theocracy, now. Or else I will not hesitate to request support from my suzerain." This was no small threat. Normally, a vessel would only call for their suzerain's aid if they felt like the survival of their species was threatened. Judging by the history of the Germanic Star-Empire, the only thing those barbarians would do to the Enochians if they successfully managed to conquer them was genocide. A smug smile appeared on Alaric's face as he spoke in perfect Enochian to the High Priestess. "Of course, you were never our target in the first place. Abandon your vessel to our conquest, and we will withdraw our forces from your borders." The beautiful angel-like creature bit her lip in frustration. She could not believe that these barbarians were forcing her to make such a horrific decision. After all, the Enochian theocracy believed that all sentient life was created in the image of their god. To abandon the Dvrakians to genocide would go against all the teachings she preached as the High Priestess of the Enochian theocracy. Even if she personally found the red-skinned devils to be particularly hideous, that did not mean that they deserved to go extinct, and thus she was quick to make her demands, which she could only back up through the threat of her masters. "I will do so, but only if you agree not to exterminate the Dvrakians like you have done to so many others in the past. If you do not agree to this request, then I will call upon my suzerain, who will certainly punish you for your wicked deeds." Alaric merely scoffed. His society was exclusively atheist and found religion to be nothing more than primitive superstition that somehow managed to carry over into the interstellar age. Still, the goal was not to expend their military resources in a war with a subgalactic power. Even if they might have a chance of emerging victorious, they could not replace the damage dealt in such a conflict within 3 years, which was the deadline before Terminus arrived in their sector of space. Under normal circumstances, Alaric would tell 2 High Priestess to suck on a fat cock simply out of the principle of the thing, but right now, he needed the Dvrakians as a buffer against the Narku. And, thus, he simply sighed and nodded his head in agreement, before making up some excuse that made it seem like he would keep his word. Very well, I can spare the Vrakians. After all, I find their women to be quite attractive. They will make excellent slaves for my people's pleasure. The high priestess looked at Alaric with absolute disgust, not because of his words. In fact, pleasure slaves were a quite common fate for species which were deemed to be attractive by their conquerors. No, what caused the high priestess to revile in such an over-exaggerated way was because Alaric had said that he found the red devils to be attractive. First off, she had never heard of the Germanic Star-Empire considering anyone other than their own as attractive, and the very idea that it would be those red devils, instead of her race filled her with fury, partially due to her wounded pride, as a race that even the Alfheim Dominion considered being exceptionally attractive. If only the Enochian theocracy was considerably more powerful, then they too would have the privilege of being a vessel of the Alfheim Dominion. Upon seeing the look on the high priestess's face, Alaric's lips curled into a sneer as he accurately guessed that the woman's pride had been wounded, before making a suggestion which only further enraged her. Oh? Are you perhaps jealous? Well, don't worry, your race is also quite attractive. If you really want, I suppose I can take your species as pleasure slaves as well. The nerve that this man had was enough to make the high priestess rethink some of her religious teachings, however she forcibly calmed herself before responding to the Grand Admiral with a particularly irritated tone in her angelic voice. Do what you want with those filthy devils. We will withdraw our fleets immediately. As for how long it takes you to conquer their civilization, that depends on your ability. LL New Centrius ad N0 LBI. CM. Alaric simply smiled before responding in a smug voice. It has been a pleasure doing business with you. After saying this, he hung up and recalled his armadas from the territory of the Enochian theocracy and its 6 other vassals. The Grand Admiral then deployed the full might of the imperial military into the borders of the Dvrakia consortium, with the intent to end the war as quickly as possible. Erich shot down his 100th kill after only 3 hours of combat. Having done so, he observed the Enochian warships which still remained intact spool up their warp drives and flee from the battlefield, where the other 6 vassals of their civilization immediately followed suit. When it finally dawned on the Dvrakia forces that they had been abandoned by their masters and allies, they felt as if all hope was lost. Still, the Germanic Star-Empire had a reputation for genocide, and thus, they did not dare cease their hostilities, in fear of the consequences that awaited their species if they should do so. Thus, even though the war was now guaranteed to end in a Germanic victory, the Dvrakians would force the Germanic military to fight tooth and nail over the distance of 300 star systems in order to fully subjugate the minor power which defied their conquest. Chapter 23 The Aftermath. After the first battle where the Germanic Star-Empire emerged victorious against the Dvrakia consortium, Erich immediately headed to the hangar bay to rearm and refuel, as well as repair any damage that might have been dealt to his interceptor during the battle. While standing in the hangar waiting for his starfighter to become fit for service, Erich noticed a few of the pilots from another unit who were smoking tobacco. No doubt to calm their nerves after such a chaotic event. Erich had never smoked before in his life and had honestly never expected to. After all, tobacco could seriously affect one's health, and though the technology existed to repair any and all damage which the body could suffer, he would prefer not to have to go to the hospital to seek treatment when he had inevitably developed cancer. Or so he initially thought. However, after enduring the intense stress of combat, Erich now knew why every man he had ever met took part in the disgusting habit. Thus, he slowly approached his fellow pilots, while attempting to control his jittering hands which shook as if he were a crack addict going through withdrawal. The 2 men did not even notice Erich approach them until he began to speak. However, due to the overwhelming anxiety he felt at this moment, he slightly stuttered as he did so. See. Can I bum one of those cigarettes off? Why, you guys? Though Erich wore the uniform of a Special Forces pilot, this was in fact his first combat mission, and because of this he appeared incredibly nerve-wracked as he approached the pilots, who served in a regular unit. Despite the difference in their capabilities, these men were as calm as one could be, as if they had already long since seen all the horrors which the universe had offered. Upon seeing that Erich was literally shaking, one of the men took pity on him and handed him a cigarette, where he then lit the device. Erich took a long drag from the cigarette before expelling the smoke from his lungs, an act which seemed to have significantly calmed his body, as he was no longer shaking and instead was able to gain full control over his limbs once more. The man who had handed Erich the cigarette closely observed his condition and chuckled after exhaling smoke, before commenting on his unsightly appearance. First time, huh? Erich did not bother denying what was blatantly obvious and nodded his head thrice in silence. To which the veteran pilot smiled and clapped Erich on the back before giving him some comforting words. Trust me, it gets easier, and judging by the fact that you are wearing the uniform of Black Sun, I'm guessing it won't be long before you become accustomed to the horrors of war. You did good out there, kid. The fact that this is your first combat mission, and you made it back in one piece, shows you have got some serious skills. But the war has only just begun, and I'm willing to bet it will be at least 3 months before a minor power like the Dvrakia Consortium is on their knees while begging us to spare their pitiful race. So, take a short break, you have more than earned it, and when the time comes to launch again, you take comfort knowing that you now have the experience to properly navigate the battlefield. Good luck, kid, you are going to need it. After saying this, the pilot put out his cigarette and placed his helmet on his head, where he then approached the fighter that was obviously his, and climbed back into the cockpit, waiting for the next battle to begin. As for Erich, he would remember the man's words for the rest of his military career. Thus, he finished his cigarette before going back to his unit, who were busy counting their losses. Dash. The war for Dvrakia had only just begun, and yet in the first major exchange between the two factions the Germanic Star-Empire had emerged victorious. Not only had they crushed the Dvrakia fleet, but they laid waste to their backers in such horrific fashion that the Enochian theocracy had no choice but to withdraw from the war and abandon their vessel to their fates. News naturally spread about the might which the Germanic Star-Empire displayed. This was something that shocked even the other major galactic powers. Though the GSE commonly waged war on behalf of their Alfheim masters, they had never shown up into a conflict in full force before, deploying at most a quarter of their naval forces. Yet today, the Germanic Star-Empire, a recent upstart on the galactic stage, had shown power that was at the very least on par with a Tier 3 regional power, if not a Tier I subgalactic power. How they had managed to create such a powerful and vast navy in such a short amount of time, with only 36 systems under their control, even the Svartalfheim Federation could not understand. Incidentally, this performance had only further added to the tensions at the border between the Alfheim Dominion and their darker cousins. At first, the Svartalfheim Federation believed that the destruction of the Rylonian civilization had weakened their rivals in the Western Quadrant. However, the Germanic Star-Empire displayed a level of military prowess that, given a few decades, could easily make up for the loss of the Rylonians. Thus at the moment the Alfheim Empress and the Svartalfheim President were in the middle of an interstellar call, discussing the border crisis which was quickly turning into a cause for all-out warfare. Lunaria's beautiful face was as smug as can be, as she boasted about the strength that her favorite warhound represented. Do you see now how powerful my little puppies are? A mere 400 years, and they are close to replacing the Rylonians. But you know all about that. After all, the last 100 wars which your proxies have fought against my loyal hounds have resulted in humiliating defeat for you. The Svartalfheim President appeared to be a rather young-looking male of the dark elven race. His skin was as brown as chocolate, his eyes a solid umber color, and his hair was as black as space itself. He did not take kindly to Lunaria's remarks, and was quick to remind her that he was not the only threat which she faced. I would not be too happy if I were you. The Hive Fleet Terminus is still ravaging your territory as we speak. And since you have mustered all of your forces on my borders, that means you have nobody in your quadrant who is capable of defeating the Narku. I wonder how many of your direct vassals will fall to the devouring swarm before you are able to deal with them. Despite the antagonistic words which the Dark Elf President had spoken, Lunaria did not seem the least bit upset, as if she knew something about the Narku which her rival did not. This only caused the Dark Elf President's expression to soar, especially after Lunaria mocked him for his efforts to cause her grief. You think your fleets are capable of deterring me from defeating the Narku? I'm afraid not, and while it will take some time to effectively deal with those fucking bugs, I assure you that within 3 years' time, Terminus will be dealt with. And then, you will have to deal with my entire attention. I wonder if you filthy mutts will be able to endure my wrath when the time comes to unleash it upon you. After all, Christerius, you and I both know how inefficient and corrupt your federation is when compared to my empire. By the time my forces invade your borders, we will be halfway to Svartalfheim before your petty congress can even approve a declaration of war. You hold no power, and to sit here and threaten a sovereign such as myself? Well, it is just laughable. Perhaps I might just dispatch my dogs of war and see how they deal with the armed forces of a so-called galactic power. After all, they seem to be handling your allies well enough. Lunaria did not even give the president of the Svartalfheim Federation a chance to respond. She quickly hung up after getting the last word in, before calling up the Grand Admiral of the Germanic Star-Empire. When Alaric answered the frequency, he gazed upon the beauty of the Alfheim Empress, and bowed ever so slightly as a sign of respect. Your Majesty, I must say I was not expecting your call at this time. Is everything all right? Having just boasted about her warhound's strength to her primary rival on the galactic stage, Lunaria naturally wanted to check up on her subordinates to see how their current war with the Dvrakia Federation and their allies was going. But mostly, she just wanted to congratulate them on their victory well in advance. Congratulations, Admiral, in a single battle you eliminated 99% of your enemy's fleet and sent their allies scurrying back to their homes. If you ask me, the Enochians have always been a bit full of themselves, and it is good to see them receive a proper spanking from my most beloved pets. I swear, my mother made one comment about how beautiful their former high priestess was as a sign of respect, and all of a sudden their entire race thinks they are the most physically attractive species in the universe. It's simply delusional. But enough about my personal feelings towards those winged twats. After all, it is not my place to interfere with the lives of my vassals. Unlike those dark-skinned dregs, we light elves do not force our political beliefs on our subordinates. So tell me, Admiral, how long do you believe it will take before you have wrapped this war up, and what do you estimate your losses will be by the end of this whole ordeal? Alaric forced a smile as he heard the Alfheim Empress refer to him and his race as mere pets. If not for the ultimate power this woman wielded, he would be quick to respond to her words with some rather vulgar language. However, he was ultimately forced to swallow his pride and ignore the words she spoke, which were an enormous insult to him and his people. Even Lunaria did not mean them that way. Because of this, Alaric would not dare deny Lunaria's request, even if she asked for some highly classified information. And thus he spoke in a calm and rather cheerful tone as he informed the Alfheim Empress of the GSC's progress in their current conflict. It is as you say, the Dvrakians are entirely on their own, and while our navy is now unopposed in this conflict, for only a small minority of the enemy's ships escaped intact, they still appear to be willing to fight us tooth and nail. Thus, I believe we will be in for a long and bloody struggle. No doubt as a result of our fearsome reputation. Initially, it would take us a mere 3 months to force a surrender against such a petty foe. However, as things currently stand, we can expect at least 6 months, possibly a year, before we have landed our armies on every planet and crushed all resistance. Losses will be minimal. After all, the enemy utterly lacks the offensive capabilities to pierce the power armor which is issued to every one of our star marines. At least in terms of small arms, and any armored vehicles they may have will be scrapped the moment they come into contact with our own. New N0 Whale chapters are published on N0VE, Pound, IN. Co-M. So rest assured, we will be ready, and willing to fight the Narku until the bitter end. And with the Dvrakians as our buffer, we will be able to bleed the Hive fleet dry in brutal urban warfare, thus giving us a better chance of survival once they have entered our borders. Lunaria smiled and nodded her head in agreement with what Alaric had said, though it was a pity the war would have to last such a long time. She doubted the GSE would ever be able to convince their enemies that they did not intend to wipe out their species, at least not directly. Thus, the Dvrakia armed forces would have to be utterly crushed on each and every world they own, until all resistance was futile. With this in mind, the Alfheim Empress made one last remark before seizing the call. Keep up the good work, Admiral, and I look forward to your inevitable victory. Chapter 24 Atmospheric Combat. The war against the Dvrakia consortium continued and, before Erich realized it, a month had passed. By now, he had participated in over 15 battles. Some were in space, while others were in the atmosphere of the habited worlds that their enemies dwelled upon. Today was no different. In fact, the entire schedule of Erich's daily life since the war had begun was a 24-hour cycle of fighting, with minimal sleep. To cope with the meager 2 hours of rest that he would get each day, Erich was pumped full of adrenal stimulants, which kept his mind and body on high alert at all times. Other than the 2-hour rest break at the end of his 20-hour shift, Erich's only reprieve was when his interceptor was so damaged that it required maintenance. During this time, he would smoke like a chimney to cope with the overwhelming stress his body and mind were forced to endure as a result of the non-stop combat. All test novel on novelbin.cm. If not for the highly nutritious meals which were served on board the carrier, then Erich truly believed he might have literally died of malnutrition by now. Aside from the bland taste, the only real downside to these pre-made meals was the fact that it limited his body's need to use the restroom. While this might be practical for combat purposes, it made it so Erich did not even get a 5-minute rest to take a dump in the morning, only increasing the amount of stress that he was forced to endure. Today, the target of the First Armada's attack was a continental world, roughly the size of Mars, which housed a few billion Dvrakians. For 3 days straight, the Armada had bombarded the surface of the world, and yet those troops who resided on the surface had still refused to surrender. Thus, today was the day which the assault began. As a result, thousands of landing craft were prepared to drop the Star Marines onto the planet's surface as well as the armored vehicles they made use of. As for Erich, his objective was simple: provide air support to the Star Marines. Thus, he would be forced to pilot his interceptor into the atmosphere of the planet and engage with any atmospheric craft the enemy might have left over, as well as target anti-aircraft weaponry and any other hostiles which High Command designated in need of termination. By now, Erich's interceptor had half of its paint scratched off. Though the bullet holes had been sealed, the pockmarks of the enemy fire which he had taken were still present on the hull of his interceptor. It was clear that the starfighter had received its fair share of damage over this last month while engaging with the enemy, and yet, the aircraft still stood proudly among the ranks of the Germanic Starfighter Corps, which continued their relentless assault on the Dvrakia consortium. Erich finished the drag on his cigarette before stamping out the smoldering device. He then took one glance at his interceptor before placing his helmet on his head. Only after he confirmed that the seal was airtight did Erich climb into the cockpit of his interceptor, whereupon booting up the power, he heard a familiar voice. "You doing all right there, Silber? I know you took some heavy shots from the enemy's flak cannons, but that should not be enough to put your fighter out of commission, now should it?" Erich immediately ignited his engines. He confirmed that his shields were fully charged before launching off of the hangar deck, and towards the atmosphere of the planet, whose surface was riddled with explosions. As he hit the air, Erich responded to his wing commander's remarks with a single statement. "I'm back in the fight." To which he heard a simple snicker over the line, and nothing else. Erich then piloted his starfighter through the atmosphere of the planet, where he immediately noticed that he was locked onto by the local hypersonic missiles were launched in his direction, to which he responded by activating his countermeasures, and then, aiming the plasma cannon which was mounted on a gimbal beneath the nose of his starfighter towards the location of the installment. After acquiring his target with his sights, Erich pulled the trigger on his joystick, which sent a blast of plasma directly at the anti-aircraft weapons, which immediately ignited the missiles still stored inside, and thus causing an explosion capable of wiping out all life in a 25 km radius. After emerging from the explosive blast entirely unfazed, due to the advanced nature of his energy shields, Erich got on his comms and informed the fleet that the last of the installments in this sector of the planet were eliminated. Is eliminated. You are clear for landing." A short response emerged via the comms, before Erich saw several dozen dropships descend from space and towards the surface of the planet. "Roger that. Star Marines are inbound." The dropships released an entire company of Star Marines per vehicle, while some of them even carried tanks and mobile artillery, which immediately began to make their way through the planet's surface and towards the nearest hostiles. Erich did not watch this for long, as he flew through the skies, and towards the next location, which was marked on his sensors. The Empire employed fighters and bombers that were capable of both atmospheric and vacuum-based flight. Something which not all civilizations made use of. For example, the Dvrakia civilization employed specialty fighters for atmospheric flight, and thus, it was these aircraft which were deployed to deal with Erich as he tore through their defenses with ease. Erich immediately picked up 6 fighters inbound to his location on his sensors, to which he used his telepathy to communicate instantly with his air wing. "I got 6 bogies inbound on my ass. I could use some support." Erich continued to scan the minds of his comrades, to which he received 2 responses that were in his favor. "Roger that, heading towards you, eta 3 minutes. I'll be there in 5. Just hold on." Seeing that the enemy were now only a minute away from him, Erich decided he would have to fight them himself, and thus he gunned his thrusters to max speed as he immediately shot past the enemy fighters, before taking to the skies in the hope of gaining altitude. Dogfighting in the atmosphere was different from in the vacuum of space. While most dogfights in space made use of strafing to maintain a constant sight picture on the enemy, this was something not achievable in the atmosphere, and thus he had to use more conventional methods of attack, such as the ancient tactic of boom and zoom. In other words, an aircraft would gain altitude and speed in order to have an advantage over their enemy. Luckily for Erich, his aircraft was capable of not only gaining altitude without the risk of stalling, but it even had the ability to break orbit. Thus, he shot straight into the air, until the 6 enemy fighters who gave chase began to stall and crash towards the surface. Upon seeing this, Erich nimbly turned his interceptor around so that it was facing the enemies, where he immediately began to unleash his laser repeaters and plasma cannon onto their backsides, blowing them out of the sky one by one. With the 6 enemy fighters terminated, Erich then waited for his allies to show up, where they noticed he was all alone, cruising in the sky as if he was enjoying a brief stroll. Immediately he was harassed over the comms by his fellow pilots who demanded to know where the 6 hostiles were at. "So where are they? I came all this way, and you are just cruising through the air? What the fuck happened?" Erich simply smirked, which was concealed beneath his visor's holographic projection, before responding in a conceited tone. "You guys took too long, they're already dead." Eliminating 6 enemy fighters by yourself was no easy task. Even if they were far more primitive than the ones the Germanic Star-Empire made use of. 6 fighters armed with cold fusion missiles and railguns were still able to destroy a bolt interceptor if they coordinated their attacks effectively. Yet, they were all smoldering wrecks on the surface below, while Erich appeared to be entirely unharmed. This caused the members of his squadron to look at him with a degree of respect, which they had not afforded him until now. Thus, it came as a bit of a surprise when they complimented Erich for his feats. "Goddamn, Silber. Way to go, kid." With these 6 hostiles eliminated, Erich would work alongside the 2 other fighters to conduct their atmospheric operations until the banner of the Germanic Star-Empire was waving proudly over the planet's surface. Though a month had already gone by since the beginning of the war, less than a quarter of the planets under the control of the Dvrkia consortium had fallen to the Germanic Star-Empire. The fact that they were uncontested in space, and yet they had still only conquered a handful of worlds led Erich to believe that although the Germanic Star-Empire's military might was impeccable, they did not have the manpower necessary to conquer an empire that spanned across several hundred star systems without spending considerable time and effort to do so. Something which he felt needed to be corrected in his people's future efforts to expand across the galaxy. Chapter 25: The Battle of the Bloody Gulch. Another 3 months passed by as the war between the Germanic Star-Empire and the Dvrkia consortium reached new levels of intensity. While the Dvrkia armed forces had resorted to mass conscription of its male population, as well as breaking open old storehouses filled with centuries-old weapons to engage with the enemy, the Germanic military seemed fresh and undeterred. As if each battle was a chance to prove themselves as a warrior to which their society revered above all other pursuits in life. The war was recorded by the Germanic media, who proudly displayed the gruesome scenes to its population as a proof of the strength that their empire possessed. With each passing hour, new footage from the Dvrkia worlds which were under siege was spread across the empire, and in doing so igniting the nationalism that its people felt. Currently, one of the most popular reporters in the empire, who was a relatively young woman by the name of Hedda Anderson, was on board the carrier which housed Erich and his comrades. She was going throughout the ship while interviewing soldiers on their thoughts about the war, and just so happened to come into contact with Erich, who had just climbed out of the showers, while wearing nothing but a towel. He was headed back to his bunk to change into a flight suit in preparation for his shift when he was ambushed by the reporter. Something which he did not take kindly to. A group of small cameras orbited around Erich like a flight of dragonflies, filming his appearance for the entire empire to see, where Hedda immediately asked him a question which he was not prepared to answer. "You there, mutant? What role do you fulfill on this carrier?" Erich's expression immediately turned sour as his image was filmed and broadcasted across the empire, where he then answered the reporter with a rather cold tone in his voice. "I'm a fighter pilot. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to get ready for my shift." The woman was not deterred by Erich's response, and kept pressing him for an interview, which only further got on the man's nerves. "Just a moment of your time is all I ask, and your thoughts regarding the war." When Erich heard this question, he scoffed at the very notion. He had spent the last 4 years, spending 20 hours a day in nothing but combat. What did he think of this war? What an absurd question to ask. And who in their right mind wanted to hear what a combatant thought about the war they waged? He was visibly upset by the question, something which the cameras buzzing around his face only further added to, and thus, he responded with a rather vicious tone in his voice as he spoke the honest truth. "You want to know what my thoughts are about the war? Okay, fine, here's what I think, and every other poor soul who has the misfortune of flying a starfighter. We have to work 20-hour shifts every single day. We get a 30-minute lunch break, and just enough time to shower and brush our teeth so that we maintain proper hygiene. Other than that, our life is nothing but combat. In order to cope with the overwhelming fatigue which occurs about 12 hours into our shifts, High Command has decided it would be a brilliant idea to pump all of its pilots full adrenals, so that we maintain peak performance for our shifts. Then, after I have spent the last 20 hours fighting for my life, I get to come back to my bunk, only to find that 12 other people have slept in it over the past 24 hours. By the time I wake up, I am covered in the sweat, blood, and tears of a dozen other men, where I proceed to take a shower, to which I am accompanied by twice as many men. After I finish cleaning the muck and grime off of my body, I make my way back to my bunk to prepare for my next shift, which by the way has someone else sleeping in it, only to be harassed by a reporter who wants to know something as stupid about what my thoughts are on this war. Now that you know my thoughts, how about you get those fucking cameras out of my goddamn face?" After saying this, Erich took a swipe at the cameras, and knocked them down onto the ground, where they were dismantled by the impact. The image of the silver-haired mutant lashing out at the female reporter who was just doing her job, went about as viral as one would expect it to, especially after people realized that the man in the video was the same guy who just a year ago had caused so many controversies at the Naval Academy. All over the grid, angry comments about Erich's behavior spread like wildfire, burying those concerns about the living conditions that the starfighter pilots were forced to endure. And while there were many people upset with Erich's behavior, the most unlikely source of reason came to support him. Having just finished a performance for her girl group, Erika Krieger took to the Interstellar network during her break, where she saw the video of the man whose life she had once ruined snapping at a female reporter. It was abundantly clear to the pink-haired beauty that the man was suffering from extreme amounts of stress, which judging by what he had said during his brief interview was only made worse by the chemicals which the military was pumping through his body so that he could maintain his focus on the battlefield. Which she was quick to give voice to via her social media account. So many people are quick to condemn this man for his actions. However, how many of you have ever been in his shoes? As far as I am aware, the military has never forced its pilots to work 20-hour shifts for months on end. This is unprecedented. While our species has been enhanced through centuries of genetic augmentation, we still require more than 2 hours of sleep to function properly. I can't imagine the sheer volume of stress and fatigue that our servicemen are currently enduring, all because the Admiralty is pushing for a swift victory against an enemy which poses no threat to our borders. After 4 months of non-stop combat, I too would be on edge, especially if I were ambushed by a reporter when I am half naked and trying to begin my next shift, where I could die at any moment. Our soldiers deserve better than this. Shame on Mrs. Anderson for forcing an interview out of a man who clearly did not want to participate. Erich's comments quickly washed out the fire which was raging across the interstellar network, and instead placated the masses who were quite upset over Erich's behavior. As for Erich, he did not even notice that his actions had caused another controversy, because he was too busy flying over the skies of another world, dropping a substantial payload on the enemy. In 4 months, Erich had proven himself as one of the most talented young pilots in the Germanic Starfighter Corps, so much so that he qualified to fly several types of spacecraft. Whether that was the basic light fighter known as the Dagger, or the high-speed interceptor known as the Bolt. Erich performed well in all roles he was given. Thus, it did not come as a surprise when he was selected to step in on behalf of the other members of his unit, who had perished in battle and were currently recuperating in a cloning facility several hundred light years away from the front lines. At the moment, Erich was flying a heavy bomber designated as the Scimitar, which looked like a futuristic version of the B-2 Spirit bomber from the United States Air Force during the 21st century of Earth's history. Like the B-2, the Scimitar had stealth capabilities, and thus the sensors of the Dvrakia military could not detect him as he flew through the skies of a world known as Skian. The world was a winter wasteland, of which the Dvrakia species only managed to settle its surface via the use of subterranean bunkers. And while the Star Marines were currently engaging on the surface of the snow-covered world, Erich was tasked with dropping a 1,000 kilograms antimatter bomb on a nearby shield generator. If he managed to eliminate the shield generator, then the defenses which protected the subterranean complexes would be all but defenseless against the onslaught of the Germanic military, who despite their superior technology, were struggling in their assault. The bomber flew through the air at breakneck speeds while Erich looked through his windshields, gazing upon the battle which was being conducted below. In the snow, which looked almost like white sand dunes, the Germanic Star Marines rushed towards the Dvrakia fortress, as their power armor and personal energy shields tanked the electromagnetic projectiles which the enemy fired upon them. Check out LT on novelbin.cm. There was approximately 15 kilometers of distance between the Germanic armored vehicles which acted as a cover for the Star Marines, and the Dvrakia fortress, which was protected by the shield generator. If not for the shield generator, which protected the Dvrakia stronghold, then the Germanic tanks would have steamrolled through the area hours ago. What emerged through after hours of battle was a gulch which sat between both sides, and was filled with the corpses of both armies. While the Germanic automatic plasma rifles tore through the primitive body armor of their enemies with ease, the railskins which the Dvrakians used slowly pierced through the power armor and energy shields which the Star Marines wielded. And while the pile of corpses was heavily dominated by those of the Dvrakia army, more than a few bodies belonged to the Star Marines. Sensing that the battle was turning into a stalemate, with both sides hiding behind their cover and exchanging fire between the bloody gulch, Erich desperately scanned his surroundings with his sensors, searching for his target, which had yet to reveal itself. After significant effort on his part, he eventually found a large structure, concealed within the natural frozen landscape, to which he immediately ignited his engines, sending his scimitar barreling towards its target where once hovering above it, he dropped the payload, before absconding from the scene of his crime. The explosion of a 1,000-kilogram antimatter bomb was like those that were dropped upon Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but without the radioactive fallout, and because of this, the two armies that were fighting several hundred kilometers away had witnessed the mushroom cloud as it rose through the air, along with the accompanying thunder of the weapon's detonation. Almost immediately after the explosion occurred, the shockwave spread throughout the tundra, creating a pseudo-avalanche which buried both armies beneath the snow, and while the soldiers of Germanic Star-Empire dug their way out of the mess, the Dvrakians were buried alive with no way out. The end result of the bloody battle which took place in the Bloody Gulch was an overwhelming Germanic victory, as the Star Marines secured the area and eliminated what few of their enemies survived, giving them a substantial foothold on the frozen world to which they would begin their conquest. As for Erich, he was ordered almost immediately after the successful completion of his mission to return to the carrier which sat in orbit above the planet, where he would receive a verbal thrashing from his superior officer for the interview he had given to the female reporter. Chapter 26 All In. Erich stood on board the flight deck of the carrier which he served on. Standing in front of him was none other than Commander Erwin Wolf, who was absolutely livid with Erich for the actions he had taken during the brief interview he had with the field reporter known as Hedda Anderson. Like everyone else in this conflict, Irwin was being pushed beyond the natural limits of his body and mind with no way to vent his stress but through the excessive use of tobacco, and by killing the enemy on the battlefield. As a result, he instinctively took advantage of this situation to vent the frustrations he had with his daily life on the first member of his unit to act out in the eyes of the public. The man was smoking a cigarette, as was Erich, as he took a long drag before puffing out the smoke in his subordinate's face. An act which Erich simply tolerated, while wearing a stoic expression on his face, waiting for the eventual eruption that his commander would have. Which came soon thereafter. What the fuck were you thinking, Silber? You can't just assault a reporter like that. Especially when you are being broadcasted to the rest of the empire. For fuck's sake, if you really have to knock some sense into the dense cunt, then do so when you aren't being filmed, you fucking mongoloid. These fucking interviews are supposed to fill the people back home with hope about the current conflict which we are waging. And your retarded has decided to go ahead and reveal that we are all a bunch of shame-addled junkies who are being forced to fight all day long. I know your monkey brain didn't stop to think about this, but that reflects poorly on the Admiralty. Riyadh updated Centrius at nwailbin.com. Do you have any idea about the firestorm you have started on the grid because of your actions? Half of the people are pissed at you for lashing out against that fucking bitch, and the other half are now questioning the government for what they are doing to us. It doesn't help that the Supreme Leader is off on an extended visit to the Alfheim Dominion, along with the rest of the senior leadership of the party. The admiral in charge of the fleet wants me to revoke the Iron Cross that I am supposed to give you for your feats at Thericles, but I told him he can suck a bag of dicks, because you more than earned it. 100 enemy fighters shot down in a single battle, that's some damn good fucking flying, kid, so take this stupid piece of metal and wear it with pride, because at this rate you have made the admiral's shit list, and you likely won't be seeing another award for the rest of your career. Erich was astonished that the commander could both chew his ass out and tongue it at the same time. He took the medal which was given to him and observed it closely. It was nearly identical to the Iron Cross First Class, which was issued to German soldiers during the Second World War of Earth's history. Although the swastika in the center had been replaced with the black sun, which was the symbol emblazoned on the Germanic Star-Empire's flag. After looking at the medal for some time, Erich smiled and stashed it away for later use during a time when he was required to wear his dress uniform. After which, the commander looked at him as if he were an imbecile before screaming at him once more. Well, what the fuck are you waiting for? We have a war to win. With this said, Erich raised his arm and saluted his commander, before repeating the battle cry that so many other Germanic soldiers shouted. Hail victory! After saying this, he dashed off towards his scimitar bomber and climbed into its cockpit before flying down towards the frozen planet known as Skian, where he then continued his bombing campaign against the Dvrakia army who struggled to maintain their hold over the world. Dash. After his 22-hour shift was over, Erich returned to his bunk with a cigarette in his mouth. He had stripped entirely out of his flight suit and into his compression shorts before even stepping into his quarters. He was just about to climb into the grimy bed which he shared with 12 other men via a rotation of sleeping shifts, when he saw a light was on in a small corner of the room. Curious about what was going on, Erich walked over to the light and found that several of his fellow pilots were engaging in an illegal gambling match, where they were betting their share of contraband, smuggled off of the Dvrakia worlds and into the fleet. As a pilot in the Starfighter Corps, Erich was obligated to report any misconduct he might have towards his superiors, but after 4 months of non-stop combat he could not care any less about regulations, and thus, he pulled out a chair and sat down at the table, to which one of his fellow Blacksun pilots smiled and welcomed him to their little game. Silber. I never thought I would see you of all people join us. If you've got contraband, then you are more than welcome to play your hand. Don't tell me you came to us empty-handed? Erich was more confused about why his fellow pilots were not getting the little sleep they were permitted to have and were instead wasting their time with gambling. Which he was quick to ask about. Why aren't you guys sleeping? I mean, even pumped full of steams, I can barely get through the day without taking out my service pistol and blowing a hole in my head. The 4 men chuckled, before one of them handed Erich a small bottle of blood-red liquid, to which he responded to Erich with a playful tone in his voice. Go ahead, drink it. I promise you that it is not what you think it is. Erich took one gulp of the liquid and felt like his mouth was on fire. He quickly handed the bottle back while coughing up a lung. To which his fellow pilots all began to laugh before the man who gave him the beverage in the first place responded. That's the Rakia Fire whiskey, has a bit of a kick, doesn't it? You see, from what my friends in the Star Marines tell me, the Dvrakians have 2 livers, meaning it takes a hell of a lot more alcohol to get those bastards drunk than it does us, even without the physical enhancements we have. I have no idea what the hell this shit is made out of, but one shot will put you under the table. I'm surprised you are still sitting upright. Erich could barely register what the man had said, because he felt like he had just been hit in the head with a sledgehammer. His fatigued body wanted nothing more than to pass out, but the adrenaline which flowed in his veins as a result of 22 hours of combat and stimulants prevented him from doing so. Thus, after nearly 5 minutes had passed, he finally regained his senses, and yet, he felt like all the fatigue which he had accumulated over the past 4 months was instantly washed away from his body, as if he had been born anew. He looked at the fellow pilot with a new sense of clarity before asking the immediate question on his mind. Vector? Just how the hell do I get my hands on a bottle of that shit? To which the man whose call sign was Vector smiled before pulling out the bottle which Erich had just drank from, and placed it on the table for all the men to see. Beat me in a game of cards, and the bottle is yours. How about it, Silber? Did you manage to get your hands on some loot that is worth my bottle of fire whiskey? Possession of contraband of any kind was strictly prohibited and punished quite severely if discovered. However, Erich just couldn't help himself, and had indeed found some valuable contraband on the Dvrakia network which could easily land him with 10 to 20 years in a panel battalion. Seeing that all the men here were betting illicit items, Erich felt more comfortable revealing his precious secret and thus walked over to his bunk and pulled out a small drive no bigger than the tip of his thumb, where he placed it on the table before speaking the words that nobody expected. 250 yottabytes of Dvrakia porn ripped straight from their interstellar network. If you manage to win, it is all yours, and if I might make a recommendation, I suggest that you use it during your bathroom breaks to release some of your pent-up stress. The 4 men looked at Erich with a mixture of excitement, horror, and intrigue. They did not know how to react to such information, and remained utterly silent, debating whether or not they should bet for such a rare and priceless artifact, one which could easily ruin their lives if it was discovered in their possession. It was not until Vector finally spoke did the tension in the air finally cease, and when he did, he said something that nobody at the table was expecting to hear. Damn, Silber, I didn't know you were a slicer. Shit, if you can get your hands on something this valuable, those idiots in the party should have put you to work in intelligence, instead of wasting your talents on being a fucking pilot. What the man said was true. Erich was what was known as a slicer, or in the slang from 21st century Earth, he would be referred to as a hacker. He was capable of bypassing the Great Firewall of the Germanic Star-Empire and slicing into the networks of other civilizations. Depending on how he used this talent would either make him a valuable asset of the empire, or a nasty thorn in its side. Most citizens of the Germanic Star-Empire stayed within the legal confines of the grid, due to the strict penalties that came with slicing. But not Erich. No, he had always skirted on the edge of the law. Not an outright criminal, but also not a perfectly law-abiding citizen either. To Erich, slicing was a great way to get a better understanding of the galaxy, considering the strict limits that the Empire put on its own network. When the other pilots heard that Erich was a slicer, and was capable of hacking into the interstellar networks of other civilizations, they immediately became more interested in him. Thus, it came as no surprise when Vector suddenly pulled out his entire stock of the Dvrakia fire whiskey, and bet it all on a chance to obtain the sweet taboo of alien pornography. All in. Following his example, the other gamblers bet everything they had for a chance to see a bunch of Dvrakia girls in the nude, even if it was only on film. Where Erich emerged as the eventual winner of the pot. Having now gotten his hands on a literal treasure trove of contraband, Erich now felt like he would be better able to endure the stressful environment of non-stop combat. Chapter 27 The Gimderi Trade Union's representative arrives. While the Germanic Star-Empire was engaging in its war against the Dvrakia consortium, the Alfheim Dominion had sortied its fleets and had even called upon many of its vassals to come to their aid at their border with the Svartalfheim Federation. Celestia Asterion was the youngest daughter of the Light Elven Empress, yet she was chosen to be the crown princess of the Alfheim Dominion. Though she had yet to even reach 1,000 years of age, she was renowned across the western quadrant of the galaxy as a skilled admiral. Thus, she had been dispatched by her mother to the border which her dynasty shared with their darker-skinned cousins. Standing on the bridge of a mega carrier, which was over 10 kilometers in length, was the beautiful elven princess. Her long hair was as white as snow, while her eyes were as golden as the Earth's sun. Her skin was a flawless jade white, and her facial features were the absolute limit of perfection. The relatively young elven woman was dressed in a white, black and gold admiral's uniform, which had gilded epaulets, and many prestigious medals adorned above the left breast. Her skirt was relatively short, while her pristine legs were concealed with dark pantyhose and thigh-high boots. While Celestia sat upon the command chair of her capital ship, she seemed rather bored, as if the tense situation at the border was not the slightest bit entertaining to her. Thus, she could not help but exclaim these feelings aloud, even if the rest of the officers on the bridge did not want to hear her complaints. I can't believe I'm stuck here at the border, instead of fighting the Nurku Hive fleet, which is terrorizing our quadrant of space. Damn it, dark elves, who do they think they are, making trouble for us when we are in such a dire situation, and what the hell is Mother thinking allowing a mere regional power to fight against Terminus? I honestly can't tell what goes through that ancient brain of hers. Sitting in the seat near the captain's chair was a Rylonian officer who had joined the Alfheim Navy after the destruction of his civilization. Only a few million members of his species had survived the Hive fleet's attack on their civilization, and he had enlisted in the Alfheim Navy in the hopes of bringing the fight to the Nurku, but instead he was sitting at the border while monitoring the activities of his suzerain's galactic rivals. Thus, he could empathize with the prince's viewpoint while everyone else on the bridge ignored her complaints, which he immediately gave voice to. Your Highness, though I agree with your assessment of the situation at hand, the Empress's orders are absolute. But like you say, I will never understand Her Majesty's obsession with those filthy barbarians. Celestia gazed upon the Rylonian bridge officer, who she just now realized held the rank of midshipman, and closely examined him. The Rylonians were an attractive humanoid species, with facial features similar to that of the Slavic race from Earth's history. However, they had an appearance considerably closer to that of albinos with pale white skin, matching hair, and glowing white eyes. Their ears were pointed, but not to the extent of elves, and they had bioluminescent markings across their flesh were almost akin to tattoos. Celestia could only sigh and lament, knowing that such an attractive race was damned near extinction, but the man's last words had caught her interest. Specifically, the remarks about the Germanic race being filthy barbarians. In truth, Celestia knew very little about the Germanic Star-Empire other than the fact that they were a recent upstart in galactic civilization which her mother heavily favored. Until now, she had never heard the Rylonian perspective of the Germanic race, and was quick to ask the man about why he had called them such an insulting term. I'm curious, midshipman, you called the Germans filthy barbarians. That is quite the insult, and I want to know why you would refer to them by such a harsh term. The Rylonian officer had a look of contempt on his face as he began to explain his disdain for the Germanic race, who had stolen the favor of the Empress which they once had before Lunaria had discovered the fledgling empire a mere 3.5 centuries ago. Is it not self-evident? The Germanic Star-Empire commonly refers to themselves as a warrior race, yet they have no honor, nor the slightest shred of civility. When they wage war, they completely disregard the lives of innocents and will exterminate entire worlds if the conquered subjects show the slightest bit of resistance after occupation. Every species which the Germanic Star-Empire has conquered is eventually exterminated because they believe all other species are inferior to their own. They have no regard for life outside of their own kind, and they show this in the way they conduct warfare. They are not warriors, they are a bunch of barbarians and butchers. I would even argue that the Germanic Star-Empire is an even larger menace to galactic society than the Nurku, because the Nurku are mindless bugs, they act based upon pure biological instinct, while the Germans have proven themselves to be exceptionally intelligent, but absurdly unreasonable. The fact that the current Empress favors them so much is truly a concern for the well-being of all interstellar civilizations. Upon hearing this perspective, Celestia immediately began to rethink her disposition towards the Germanic Star-Empire, that is, until a member of her own race who was another officer on the bridge scoffed, before voicing his own opinion towards the Germans. They're not that bad. I mean, sure, the Germans are highly xenophobic towards other species, but that is pretty much the norm within the galaxy. If I'm being perfectly honest, most of the propaganda which you see come out of the Germanic Star-Empire is similar to what the Alfheim Dominion uses to rally its people. Luxels here is just upset that his civilization had been so thoroughly upstaged by the Germanic Star-Empire shortly before the Rylonian Imperium collapsed. If I'm remembering correctly, it was your sense of honor in warfare that led to the last 50 defeats you guys suffered at the hands of the Svartalfheim Federation's proxies. Say what you want about the Germanic Star-Empire, but to this day they have never been defeated in a war, and most of the time they have fought against civilizations superior to their own. That is why Her Majesty favors them so much. I mean hell, until roughly 100 years ago, the weapons which the Germanic Star-Empire used were primarily mass drivers and other kinetic-based weapons. The fact that the Germanic Star-Empire was able to use such primitive devices to obtain victory against armies armed with far more advanced technology is proof that they are an incredibly valuable vessel, despite only existing as an interstellar civilization for less than half a millennium. Plus, I'm not going to lie. I find them to be far more attractive than you glowing freaks. You have to admit, they look quite similar to the average light elf, albeit substantially larger. It's almost as if one of the Empress biologically engineered their species from our own genes to be perfectly suitable for combat. I mean, the Asterian dynasty is renowned for their white hair and golden eyes, but the most common phenotype which our species has is golden blonde hair and blue eyes, just like the Germans. The Rylonian officer whose name was Luxelles did not make a comment in response to the light elven officer's remarks. He simply scowled and remained silent. As for Celestia, she did not know whose perspective she should take to heart, and thus decided after this mission was over, that she would do a bit more research on the history of the Germanic Star-Empire, who appeared to have a bright future ahead of them, assuming they somehow managed to survive the onslaught of the Nurku Hive Fleet terminus. While Celestia was thinking about this subject, the sensors on board her mega carrier detected movement into the star system, which acted as the primary access point at the border between the western and eastern quadrants. To which she was quick to give an order to her fleet. Raise the shields and prepare for combat. It looks like those dark-skinned mongrels have decided to invade our borders after all. The officers on board the bridge quickly did as commanded, as the Alfheim fleet began to scramble its fighters into space in preparation for the upcoming battle. However, just when they were about to open fire on those who would intrude upon their borders, something interesting happened. A hailing frequency reached out to Celestia's ship, to which she begrudgingly accepted. On the holographic projection was a figure of a very small humanoid. By human standards, it would be considered a dwarf. The creature had long and pointy ears which drooped to the side and a hooked nose. He was incredibly fat for his size, and was dressed in rather luxurious attire. His dark beady eyes gazed upon Celestia's heavenly figure with a bit of lust within them, as his sharp teeth curved into a toothy smile before introducing himself to the light elven princess. Greetings, Your Highness, I am Trade Prince Pixel Goldentooth of the Kimderi Trade Union. I have been requested by representatives of both the Alfheim Dominion and the Svartalfheim Federation to mediate in the dispute between your two civilizations. If it is all right with you, I would like to get the Svartalfheim Federation's admiral on the line to negotiate an end to the hostilities which are clearly escalating between the both of you. Celestia scowled when she saw the hideous goblinoid creature. She despised the Kimderi race almost as much as the Dark Elves. They were a bunch of greedy merchants and bankers who had gained their fortune by infiltrating and swindling every interstellar civilization they came across. In fact, for a long time, the Kimderi did not even have their own homeworld, until they used their wealth to bribe one of the subgalactic powers to conquer an occupied world for them, which they then proceeded to spend the next few centuries ethically cleansing the locals. It had been millions of years since then, and currently, the Kimderi Trade Union effectively controlled the galactic economy. And while many civilizations considered it a mark of pride to host their banks and corporations within their borders, some, like the Germanic Star-Empire, refused to do so. Most of these civilizations were wiped out via the influence the Kimderi Trade Union had over the galaxy and its many players. However, despite their best attempts to force the Germanic race into capitulation, the protection which Empress Lunaria Asterion of the Alfheim Dominion afforded her favorite warhounds prevented the various trade princes from infiltrating and subverting Germanic society, like they had done to so many others. As up-to-dated OLS on OVL.bin.cm. Perhaps her mother's constant complaints about the Kimderi Trade Union had affected her views, but Celestia hated the Kimderi race with a passion. Unfortunately, Lunaria had been forced to reach out these pathetic little runs in order to avoid an all-out war with the Svartalfheim Dominion, and thus Celestia could only sigh and accept the bastard's request. Almost immediately after silently nodding her head, a dark elf's holographic projection appeared on the command bridge of Celestia's carrier alongside the Kimderi Trade Prince, who had a smug expression on his face as he spoke to Celestia as if she were a mere child. Did that old hag seriously send a little girl to protect her borders? My oh my, she must be going senile if she thinks it is a good idea to send you of all people to this battlefield. Just when Celestia was about to respond to this insult, Bixel shook his head and clicked his tongue in displeasure before shutting down the Dark Elf Admiral. TSK. Chronarius, that is entirely inappropriate for a discussion about decreasing hostilities. I will give you one warning before I contact my merchant fleet and discuss with them whether or not sanctions against the Svartalfheim Federation are in order. The idea of receiving economic sanctions from a trade prince of the Kimderi Trade Union was enough to instantly silence the admiral of the Federation's fleet and force him to apologize for his words. I am sorry, Mr. Goldentooth. My words were an insult to you as a mediator, and I promise to keep such remarks to myself during the future of these discussions. Bixel's mouth curved into a disgusting smile as he nodded his head in approval of Chronarius' submission, before shifting his focus back to Celestia, who was watching the exchange between the two men with a disturbed expression on her otherwise flawless face. Though the trade prince did not comment on this, and instead spoke with an excited look in his beady eyes. Now, where to begin? Chapter 28 The Kimderi. Trade Prince Pixel Goldentooth had a toothy grin on his face as he mediated the discussion between the admirals of the Alfheim Dominion and the Svartalfheim Federation. Though neither side had overtly attacked yet, the two factions were currently engaging with one another in open conflict via their proxies at the borders. Since the Alfheim Dominion was not able to call upon the Germanic Star-Empire to ravage the enemy's fleets, due to the threat which they were currently facing from the Narku Hive Fleet Terminus. Nor could she call upon the Rylonian Imperium, who were destroyed by Terminus. Lunaria had been using several of her other vassals to wage war against her rivals' proxies. However, these vassals were not societies born and bred for the purpose of war, unlike the Germanic Star-Empire, and thus, they were far more evenly matched with their opponents. While the border wars continued to wage on, the Kimderi trade prince Bixel Goldentooth had been chosen to mediate the dispute. Who began to speak of the terms he felt were most agreeable between the two factions. I think we all know what must be done here, so long as the two of you swear on behalf of your respective civilizations not to start a war. Then I believe the contested regions, which you are both fighting for control over, can be settled via your proxies, who are already engaging in combat with each other as we speak. Though I must say, I fear the Alfheim Dominion is at a disadvantage since the tragedy with the Rylonian Imperium has occurred. Perhaps if you could order those violent curs of yours to enter the fray, then you might be able to even the odds, but I hear they are currently entrenched in a war with a minor power. And it will be several months before they are able to enter this conflict. The Dark Elf Admiral smirked with satisfaction as he heard that the Germanic Star-Empire would not be able to interfere in this dispute. After all, their proxies had lost the last 100 wars with those vicious beasts, and it would appear that the Kimderi trade prince had the same opinion as the Dark Elves when it came to the Germanic people. Thus, he took advantage of the situation to gain some favor from Bixel, who had vast control over the galaxy's economy. I might be able to broker an end to these hostilities altogether. After all, if certain conditions are met by the Kimderi Trade Union, then I am sure the President will be more than happy to give up on reclaiming our lost territory. I have an offer that Mr. Goldentooth might find appealing. If the Alfheim Dominion agrees to force those savages, you refer to as Germans, to accept the Kimderi banking clans into their empire, and the Kimderi Trade Union agrees to pay us a broker's fee for arranging this agreement, then I see no reason to continue squabbling over a few border systems for the next 100 years. While this deal might seem to be beneficial to the Alfheim Dominion on the surface, the reality was that if Celestia accepted this offer, it would have long-reaching consequences. She knew that neither the Germanic Star-Empire nor her mother would ever accept this offer. After all, her mother had a policy of not interfering with her vassals' sovereignty unless they did not meet their dues. If Lunaria forced the Germanic Star-Empire to accept the Kimderi banking clans into their empire, then she would not only be losing the loyalty of her most favored warhound, but she would also be inviting rebellion from 100 other interstellar civilizations, all of which maintained their sovereignty when it came to internal matters. Such a deal would tear the Western Quadrant apart, and the Dark Elf Admiral knew this, hence why he had posed such a tantalizing deal to the avaricious trade prince. Yet, despite the consequences this would have on galactic stability, the trade prince did not even seem to care in the slightest. He was practically salivating at the idea of forcing his way into the Germanic Star-Empire, whose self-sufficient economy was a threat to the trade union's wealth and power. If the rest of the interstellar states across the Milky Way began to pursue a position of economic autarky, the Kimderi Trade Union would lose everything. This is why they had spent so much effort trying to force their way into the Germanic markets and had wasted a considerable sum turning the rest of the galaxy against the Germanic race with galactic-wide propaganda. Yet despite all their efforts, even going so far as to influence other civilizations to wage war against the Empire, the Germanic race stood untied and defiant against the Kimderi Trade Union, growing ever stronger as the years went by. Thus Bixel immediately rubbed his hands in an avaricious gesture as he sided with the Svartalfheim Dominion, and in doing so violated his position as a mediator. I must say, this is indeed an excellent proposal. I see no other alternative which can avoid an all-out war and ensure peace across the galaxy. Would you not agree, Your Highness? Celestia was practically scowling at the two-faced hook-nosed twat from the Kimderi Trade Union. Of course, he would immediately disregard his role as mediator when the first bribe came his way. As a result, Celestia immediately put her foot down in these negotiations and called out Bixel for his bullshit. It's funny, my mother once told me of a quote which originates from the first supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire when he first encountered your race. It believed it was something along the lines of, "The Kimderi is immunized against all dangers, one may call him a scoundrel, parasite, swindler, profiteer. It all runs off him like water off a raincoat. But call him a Kimderi and you will be astonished at how he recalls, how injured he is, how he suddenly shrinks back. I have been found out." The origin of this quote was a direct copy of Joseph Goebbels' remarks regarding the Jewish people of Earth, to which the first supreme leader of the Germanic Star-Empire simply substituted the word Jew with Kimderi. If one thought about every negative stereotype associated with the Jewish people, whether or not they were true, and applied it to the Kimderi race, then it would indeed be a realistic depiction of the alien species. Naturally, Bixel had heard this quote before, and was quite perturbed that the Alfheim princes would dare to utter it aloud in front of him. His beady eyes narrowed as his sharp teeth twisted into a hideous snarl. He knew exactly what the relatively young woman was accusing him of, and was insulted not because it was a false allegation, but because it was completely true. The Dark Elf Admiral was horrified that the young Light Elf Princess had the guts to call Bixel out on his schemes. He was beginning to think that the girl was either incredibly brave or an absolute moron. After all, the Kimderi Trade Union had enough power to collapse the economy of the Alfheim Dominion. By insulting one of their trade princes, with a particularly disparaging remark about their entire species, it was inviting an economic disaster. Yet, Celestia did not appear the slightest bit concerned about such a thing, and simply stared down the tiny and fat goblin before speaking aloud in an authoritative tone. The Alfheim Dominion has the military power to destroy your so-called homeworld, and don't you forget it. Now, I suggest you rethink your priorities, because from what I see, you, our supposed mediator, is seriously considering a bribe, and if that gets out to the rest of the galaxy, I wonder how many civilizations will continue to employ your species as mediators in their conflicts. Despite having every urge to employ economic sanctions against the Alfheim Dominion, Bixel did not dare do so. They had spent a considerable amount of time and effort manipulating the galaxy's perspective of their species, and if word of this little incident were to get out, then it would be disastrous for the entirety of the Kimderi trade union. Thus, with a deep breath to calm his nerves, Bixel forced a toothy smile as he nodded his head in agreement with Celestia's assessment, before going back to the initial plan of de-escalation. Very well, you have made your point. I believe I have no choice but to decline your offer, Admiral. Instead, I will stick to my initial proposal of continuing this conflict via proxies. Are there any objections to this from either side? Celestia silently shook her head, showing that she had no objections. While the Dark Elf Admiral was visibly scowling over the fact that his bribe had been denied and was forced to revert this conflict back to a proxy war. While gritting his teeth, he agreed to the original deal, and begrudgingly so. Fine. I have no qualms about this resolution. Whoever wins this proxy war gets control of the contested star systems. After saying this, the Dark Elf Admiral hung up, leaving the Kimderi Trade Prince and Light Elf Princes alone, to which Bixel chuckled sinisterly as he made a foreboding remark. You better watch your back, Princes, the remarks that you just made have made you an enemy of the Kimderi, and you know as well as I what happens to those who oppose us. Discover new stories at nvlbion.co. After saying this, Bixel hung up as well, leaving Celestia by herself as she sighed heavily. Realizing that although she had avoided plunging the Western Quadrant into chaos, she had just painted a target on her back by a race that was known for covertly assassinating those who posed a threat to their narrative. With this in mind, the Crown Princess of the Alfheim Dominion suddenly found herself having more respect for the Germanic Star-Empire, who so boldly told the truth about the Kimderi, despite the danger it presented to their entire civilization. Chapter 29 Overdose. The Germanic Star-Empire was entirely unaware of how close they were to being forced by their suzerains to allow the banking clans of the Kimderi trade union into their territory. If this were to have happened, it would have shattered the bonds between the Alfheim Dominion and their favorite hounds. It would have only be a matter of time before the Germanic nation rose up in arms against their masters. Nor were they aware of the risk that the Alfheim Dominion's crown princes had taken to ensure their sovereignty over internal matters. But just because the Germans did not know of these things, it did not mean that the Alfheim Empress was so ignorant. In fact, just after the conference call ended between Celestia, Bixel, and Cronarius, the young admiral contacted her esteemed mother to report on the situation at hand. When Lunaria heard that her daughter had been threatened by one of those slimly little scoundrels, she had every intention of sending her fleets to decimate the Kimderi homeworld. However, in the end, she decided to increase the security around her youngest daughter and send a stern warning to all the Kimderi trade princes that if Celestia were to wind up dead or missing, she would hold their people responsible and wipe them from the face of the galaxy. As for Erich, even if he was aware of the dispute between the Asterian dynasty and the Golden Tooth cartel, which had emerged as a result of the border wars, he could not have cared any less. Instead, he was busy flying over yet another Dvrakia world, fighting what was left of the enemy's starfighter corps. While the capital ships of the Dvrakia Navy had been decimated over the skies of Therakles, the consortium still maintained the ability to manufacture warships. But, rather than waste their precious resources on larger ships like destroyers and battleships, they adopted a policy of mass-producing fighters and bombers to protect what few worlds they still held on to. At first, these new waves of small spacecraft were piloted by Dvrakians, but as the numbers of their available pilots rapidly dwindled, the Dvrakia consortium was forced to operate what remained of their fleet with robotic pilots powered by primitive artificial intelligences. These robots were not as capable as actual trained pilots, and thus they were even more easily shot out of the sky, but they were easy to manufacture, and could be mass-produced in quantities that far outpaced the consortium's ability to train new pilots. Thus, while robots fought in the orbit of the remaining Dvrakia worlds, the rest of their military focused primarily on defending the planets from the Germanic ground forces. At the moment, Erich was sitting in his cockpit. By now, all the paint had been scratched off his interceptor. The machine was only operable due to the cannibalization of other starfighters which were damaged beyond repair during the war. The war had been raging on for nearly 8 months at this point, and most of the Dvrakia consortium had fallen. As the vanguard of the invasion, the First Armada was left without resupply for months on end, forcing the crews on board the vessels to become quite creative in how they maintained their ships. In the entirety of the Germanic Star-Empire's military history, they had never once advanced their troops beyond the reach of their supply lines, having learned from the mistakes of their ancestors on Earth centuries prior. However, with the Narku hive fleet so near to their borders, and getting ever closer with each passing day, the Admiralty was convinced that sacrifices needed to be made to ensure that their plans to use the Dvrakians as a buffer were actually accomplished in time, thus deciding to push past them this once, for victory was in sight. Of course, the rank and file of the Empire's forces did not know about this great threat which was lurking beyond their borders, and thus, the veterans of the Dvrakia War had become quite disgruntled due to the way they were treated in the conflict. Erich could not remember the last time he had gotten more than 2 hours of sleep. By now, even the Dvrakia fire whiskey had lost its refreshing effect, and he was becoming quite drowsy as he piloted his interceptor through the orbit of what appeared to be an oceanic world. Realizing that his eyelids were closing on their own, Erich reached towards his left thigh with his offhand, and grabbed hold of what resembled an EpiPen from 21st century Earth. However, the container was entirely transparent, revealing the neon green liquid that was contained within it. Normally Erich would carry 4 of these things on the left thigh of his flight suit to get him through his 22-hour shift, but after only 12 hours of combat, he had already been through 3 of them. His vision began to fade as he mumbled something that was barely coherent. Fug, last one. After saying this, Erich pressed the top button of the device which revealed a hypodermic needle, which he then jammed through his left thigh, into the femoral artery, which rapidly carried the stimulant through the rest of his body, forcing his eyes open to their maximum width. Erich felt as if his brain had cleared right up in a single second, and shortly thereafter an eager smile had replaced the drooling gape that was his mouth. He felt as if he were a living god, that no harm could possibly come to him, and as a result he eagerly hit the throttle of his interceptor to the maximum speed, sending him zooming through orbit and towards his allies who were requesting backup. Either he did not see it, or he did not care, but the hole that was punctured into his pressurized flight suit immediately sealed itself, preventing any and all oxygen from escaping. The interceptor shot through space at a rapid speed, before Erich began to pull back his throttle as he quickly approached his target. No more than 5,000 kilometers out, there was another interceptor that looked almost exactly like his own, which was taking fire from 3 hostiles. As a result, Erich flipped the switch on his joystick, activating his missiles as he locked onto all 3 targets at once. Normally, a pilot would only be able to lock onto one target at a time, but, because of Erich's cyberkinesis, he was able to push the targeting array beyond its limits, and thus, when he pressed the button, 3 missiles were launched at the target which, despite the enemy's best attempts to launch their countermeasures, the missiles continued towards their targets until detonating on their hulls. Erich screamed through his comms in excitement as he saved his allies while also eliminating 3 hostiles in one go. Woo! Take that, you worthless hunks of scrap metal! An annoyed voice called out to Erich from the other end of the line, which he recognized as his wing commander. Dammit Silber, those were mine. Erich simply chuckled before responding to the wing commander's complaint with a voice that was unnaturally speedy. Sorry, Commander, but you snooze you lose. Besides, I just saved your ass. You owe me. Webnovel chapters are published on Novale, bin.com. Judging by how quickly Erich spat out those words, it did not take the wing commander long to realize that Erich had just popped another one of his steams, and thus decided not to argue with the man while he was as high as one could be. Instead, his voice shifted to one of concern as he asked the question which he was not sure that he wanted an answer to. Silber, how many of those steams do you have left? Erich did not even need to think about the number of steams he had taken before responding to the commander with a carefree voice. That was my last one. I suppose I should go back and get more, huh? Contrary to what Erich was expecting, the voice of the commander immediately turned to one filled with anger as he yelled at Erich over the comms with all the fury he could muster. You fucking idiot! You took all 4 of your steams in 12 hours? Get your ass back to the carrier and check in with medical before you overdose. If we end up losing another interceptor because of an overdose, the Admiral will have my ass. Erich did not even think about the possibility of an overdose when he had taken all 4 of his steams because his brain had been too exhausted to even calculate the risk. However, now that his mind was fully clear, he realized how badly he had fucked up. Thus, his heart immediately began to palpitate as an overwhelming sense of anxiety filled his mind. He only managed to get out one word before darting back towards the carrier at top speed. Roger! With this, Erich flew back to the carrier as fast as he could. However, as he was approaching the hangar, he found that his mouth had begun to foam and his muscles had begun to seize. If he did not manage to slow down soon, he would crash right into the hangar and not only blow himself up, but also take quite a few other pilots, and their starfighters, with him. Unfortunately, he could not manage to control the joystick, nor could he speak properly into his comms to request an immediate landing, thus all he could do was muster all the strength left in his body and force a crash landing onto the deck. As Erich had approached the landing bay without proper authorization, the point defenses of the capital ship began to fire at him, which battered his shields until there was nothing left. However, he just barely managed to slip past the ship's defenses before his starfighter could be blown apart, and in doing so crashed into the landing bay. The interceptor skid through the deck, grinding itself apart as it slowly made its way to the other end. Just before the fighter was about to crunch into a pancake against a massive wall, it came to a full stop, where the carrier's quick reaction force rapidly approached the heavily damaged starfighter with their plasma rifles in hand. Once they managed to force open the shattered cockpit, they found an unconscious pilot who needed immediate medical attention. As for the damage that Erich had caused to the actual carrier, it was minimal and could easily be repaired once they finally managed to dock back in Imperial space. Erich awoke on a bed some time later while dressed in nothing but a patient's gown. He did not know how he had gotten into this strange chamber, which he knew to be what was referred to by the Empire as a maid bay, but he could guess one of two things had occurred. Either he died and was now cloned on some facility within the Empire's borders, or he had been successfully transported to the medical facility on board the carrier and stuffed into a maid bay while unconscious, which automatically repaired all the damage that his body had received. One thing was certain, all the fatigue, pain, and stress he had endured over these past 8 months had suddenly vanished. It was because of this that he truly believed he had died and been cloned. However, this was not the case, as the medbay quickly opened itself, to reveal that he was indeed sitting in the medical clinic on board the carrier. Standing over Erich was the ship's doctor, who shook his head and sighed before informing his patient of just what had happened. Honestly, kid, you are lucky to be alive. It probably would have been more efficient to just euthanize you and have you cloned. But the Admiral insisted that all pilots who could be saved must be saved. After all, we are already short-staffed as is. Do you have any idea what kind of damage you have done to your body? 4 stimulants in merely 12 hours? What? Were you trying to get yourself killed? Well, come on. Don't just gawk at me like an idiot, answer me. Erich had never before in his life been injured enough to use a medbay, and he was still getting over the idea that no matter how mangled his body was, no matter how much damage had been dealt to his internal organs by the overdose, he had emerged perfectly fine. In fact, he was better than before. After taking a few moments to formulate a proper response, he finally spoke to the doctor. I didn't mean to. I was just so tired that I couldn't perform my duties. I didn't even think about a possible overdose, and instinctively jammed that needle into my thigh. How much damage to the ship did I cause? To this, the doctor scoffed, before informing Erich that he hadn't caused much damage at all. You really think that puny fighter of yours is capable of damaging one of these carriers in any significant capacity? The only damage you dealt was to yourself and your interceptor. Fixing you was an easy task, but fixing that damaged ship of yours, with the limited supplies we currently have? That is going to be a challenge. Luckily, I became a doctor and not a mechanic. Because I have no idea how they are going to repair that scrap heap. Now, judging by the fact that you are capable of carrying a conversation, I would say you are no longer my problem. Report to your wing commander so he can give you a proper scolding. After saying this, the doctor tossed Erich a new flight suit before walking out of the room. He had other patients that he needed to tend to, and now that Erich was out of the maid bay, it could be used by someone else. Erich, however, felt a particular sense of dread in his chest, as he just knew it was a matter of certainty that he was going to get chewed out for what he had just done. Chapter 30 Rest and Respite. Erich could not remember the last time he had been scolded so severely. After the battle was won, he was forced to meet up with his wing commander, who did not hesitate to rip him a new one over the damage he had caused. Without a doubt, the interceptor which Erich had flown up until this point was completely mangled beyond repair. As a result, he would be tasked with flying a bomber for the rest of the war. Or until a resupply could happen. However, that was unlikely to occur, at least not for the First Armada, who in order to push the pace of the conflict, had advanced so far beyond supply lines that they would literally need to flee from their current position by several dozen light years before being able to replace that which they had lost. Despite the urgent need for pilots in the First Armada, the doctor on board the carrier had decided to put his foot down and somehow managed to convince the Admiral to allow the men who operated the starfighters to get some proper rest. After all, Erich was not the first pilot among the ranks of the Imperial Navy who had been pushed to the point of overdosing on stimulants. Thus, for the time being, Erich was grounded and was required to get at least 2 weeks of rest before he was allowed anywhere near a cockpit. This was perhaps the slowest time had moved since the man had first entered military service, as a life revolving around non-stop action seemed to have permitted time to pass by quite rapidly. Now that he was stuck on the carrier for 24 hours a day, Erich did not know how to spend his time, and had even begun to feel a sort of mental withdrawal towards the lack of action. Luckily, he had access to the grid, and thus, for the first time in 8 months, he was able to see what was going on within the borders of the Empire. The first thing that popped up on his display screen was the advertisement for Erika Krieger's new drama, which she would be starring in. Looking upon the face of the woman who had caused him so much grief filled Erich with disgust as he scoffed before voicing his disbelief aloud. For fuck's sake, she's acting now? Just kill me now. The pop-up immediately shifted to a movie trailer, which, try as he might, Erich found himself unable to skip out of. Whether or not the girl actually had any talent as an actress, Erich did not know the answer, but one thing was certain, the Germanic entertainment industry was heavily pushing her on all of its citizens. Finally, after enduring through nearly 3 minutes worth of content he would rather not see, Erich was finally able to move on to the news, where he found that the war had taken up much of the broadcast. Luckily, the previous controversies he had been instrumental in creating had died down, as the Empire seemed to forget that the silver-haired mutant had even existed, and instead focused on cheering for their servicemen who fought against a horde of demons. Interestingly enough, one of the videos which was being displayed on the news was from the Battle of the Bloody Gulch, which had occurred months ago. At first Erich thought he might be seeing things, but there was no mistake. The antimatter bomb which exploded on camera was the one he had dropped on the Dvrakia shield generators. The craziest thing of all was that this footage as being displayed with the banner, live from the front lines, which only caused Erich to believe that the Empire was purposely throttling the coverage of the war, perhaps because of how much of a meat grinder it had become. The Dvrakia military, while technologically inferior to the Germanic armed forces, had one thing on their side that the Empire did not. And that was the time. Because the Germanic Star-Empire was forced to advance so far beyond their supply lines, they had become severely limited in the number of troops and resources they could commit to the war. In fact, the other 9 armadas, which the Empire had deployed to the region, were busy in cleaning up the mess that the first armada had left behind, while establishing a foothold over the war-torn worlds. And while the other 9 armadas were practically fresh in terms of rest, resources, and manpower, the first armada continued to plow forward through a storm of electromagnetic projectiles, as they attempted to end the war as quickly as possible. Now that Erich thought about it, he did not understand why the Admiralty had forced the first armada into such a desperate position, when any of the other 9 armadas could be used to relieve them. Had the admiral in charge of the first armada done something to anger his superiors? Explore new ovals on nwlb.com. Ultimately, the reason that the first armada had become the spearhead of the Germanic invasion was actually a policy of maintaining reserves. As the war with the Dvrakians continued to wage on, the Empire was vastly expanding its armed forces at the home front. 100 fleets had become 150 in a little over half a year. And despite the fact that these 50 fleets could be used to end the war quicker, it also meant that the Empire would be giving up many of the resources it had just managed to create. Meanwhile, the first armada might be pushed to the breaking point, but so far they had managed to claim over 80% of the Dvrakia consortium without reinforcements or resupply. Thus, until they were operating as a skeleton crew, the Admiralty would continue to press forward the unit, which had already suffered the most losses, rather than incur more losses from other armadas. Of course, the more losses the first armada suffered, the fewer men they had to support their campaign, and thus they would suffer even more casualties at a higher rate. But this was a risk the Admiralty was willing to take. Naturally, Erich did not know any of this. He was just a simple lieutenant, and thus he was not privy to the machinations of high command. Thus, he could only continue to watch the news and witness the battlefield on the ground from the perspective of the Star Marine's helmet cams. Sitting in a rectangular room within the naval headquarters on the world of Germania was the Grand Admiral of the Imperial Navy, and several members of the Admiralty, who had all gathered together in person to discuss the serious matters which they were facing. Admiral Erich Emery sat in silence with a stoic expression on his face as he listened to his subordinates speak about the ongoing improvements they had been making to the fleet. Thanks to the generosity of the Alfheim Dominion, we have been able to improve our energy shields by roughly 50%. These modifications are currently being made to the 50 fleets that are waiting within the borders of the Empire, and will be retrofitted onto the 100 which are currently deployed abroad after the war with the Dvrakia consortium has been won. It might not seem like much, but it does give us a slightly better chance at surviving the upcoming Narku invasion. Alaric sighed heavily when he heard this, before responding in a way that immediately crumbled the confidence which had been built among his subordinates after hearing this statement. A measly 50% increase in power to our energy shields is not going to stop a Narku hive fleet from tearing us apart. We need to invest in weapons like the AM-59 World Killer Torpedo. Weapons that are capable of one-shotting the ships of our enemies. And unless we can develop more of such weapons, we have a very small chance of survival. Now, enough about the Narku. We will deal with them when the time comes. I want to know about the ongoing crisis which our soldiers are facing at the front lines in the war with the Dvikia consortium. Is it true that we have lost 75% of our starfighter pilots amongst the first armora? A quarter of which were from overdosing on stimulants? At this rate, the first armada will have a difficult time defending the drop ships, let alone the capital ships. The Admiralty paled after hearing the figures that the Grand Admiral had just spoken. It was indeed true that the first armada had suffered heavy losses over the past 8 months, with 75% of the pilots having either been killed in combat or dying of drug overdoses. Those who died were cloned back in the Empire with all their memories intact, but there was simply no way to transport them from the borders of the Empire back to the front lines of war, and even if they could, what ships would they fly? Knowing this, nobody dared to speak up, which only confirmed the figure to be true in. With a fierce gaze in his eyes, Erich gave the order, which the rest of the admirals had been waiting to receive for months now. Withdraw the first armada back to the Empire. I want it repaired, resupplied, and filled with reinforcements. As for those 25% of pilots who are still on the front lines, even as we speak, give them 4 months of leave, they have more than earned it. We will replace the first armada with the second and third armadas, who will continue the assault on the remaining 20% of worlds that the Dvikia consortium still has a hold over. I do not want something this embarrassing to happen ever again. Am I understood? The other admirals obediently nodded their heads like children being scolded by their parents. With this said, the first armada would finally be given some reprieve after 8 months of non-stop combat.